There is a photograph that has been passed around for decades now. It is black and white, slightly grainy, the kind of image that belongs to another world entirely. In it, a young man stands on a football field in Miami, his right index finger raised high above his head. His jersey is white, smeared with grass and dirt from the game he has just finished playing. His helmet is off, tucked under his left arm, or perhaps already handed to a teammate. His dark hair is swept back, slick with the sweat of a warm January afternoon, and there is a grin on his face that tells you everything you need to know about what has just happened. That grin carries the weight of vindication, of triumph, of a promise made and a promise kept. He has just done something that no one in the football world believed was possible. He has just beaten the most powerful, most dominant, most feared team in professional football. And 3 days before that game, he stood in front of a room full of reporters and broadcasters and football dignitaries, looked them dead in the eye, and told them exactly what was going to happen. That man was Joe Namath, and that moment, that single afternoon in January of 1969, changed everything. It changed the way quarterbacks carried themselves. Before Namath, a quarterback was expected to be humble, deferential, almost invisible off the field. After Namath, a quarterback could be a star, a personality, a brand. It changed the way professional football was marketed to the American public. The league had always sold the game itself, the collisions, and the strategy, and the drama of competition. After Namath, the league learned to sell the men who played the game, their faces, and their stories and their personalities. It changed the balance of power between two rival professional leagues that had been locked in a bitter, expensive struggle for attention, for television contracts, for the loyalty of fans, and for the very soul of a sport that was rapidly becoming the most popular form of entertainment in America. One guarantee, one game, one performance. And a young kid from the steel country of Western Pennsylvania was suddenly the most famous football player on the planet. But the story of Joe Namath is not simply the story of one game or one guarantee. That is where most people begin, and far too often, that is where they stop. They remember the finger pointed at the sky. They remember the fur coats draped over his shoulders on the sideline. They remember the nickname Broadway Joe and the image of a handsome, confident young quarterback who seemed to live his life at a volume and intensity that the rest of the sporting world could not match. They remember the surface of the man. They remember the spectacle. But they stop there, and when they stop there, they miss something essential about who Joe Namath really was and why his story still matters. The real story runs much wider and much deeper than a single Sunday afternoon in Florida. It is the story of a boy who grew up in a place where the mills belched thick smoke into perpetually grey skies, and fathers came home at the end of their shifts with soot embedded in the creases of their hands and the lines of their faces. It is the story of a family that worked hard and lived modestly, and understood that life does not hand you anything for free. It is the story of a college career at the University of Alabama under the legendary Paul Bear Bryant, one of the most demanding and successful coaches in the history of any sport, a man who saw in Namath something raw and electric and almost uncontrollable, a talent so immense that it both thrilled and terrified the man charged with developing it. It is the story of a professional career that was defined as much by pain as by brilliance. Joe Namath's knees were damaged before he ever played a professional game. They were operated on, rehabilitated, and damaged again in an agonizing cycle that repeated itself for more than a decade. Every throw he made, every game he played, every season he endured was a negotiation between his extraordinary talent and a body that was slowly, steadily, relentlessly betraying him. The right arm was perfect, the knees were ruined, and in the vast, complicated space between the two, the entire drama of his career played out. And it is the story of fame itself, of what it means to be truly famous in a country that celebrates and consumes its heroes with equal intensity. Joe Namath was not just a football player who happened to be well known. He was a cultural phenomenon, a man whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any football field. He wore white shoes when every other player wore black. He grew sideburns when coaches demanded clean-shaven faces. He wore fur coats on freezing sidelines. He appeared in pantyhose commercials on national television. He dated actresses and models. He owned a bar in Manhattan. He lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side of New York City and drove a green Lincoln Continental convertible and stayed out until the early hours of the morning and did everything, with a swagger and a joy that the sports world had never seen from a quarterback before. He was Broadway Joe, and that nickname was more than a label. It was a declaration of identity, a statement about who this man was and how he intended to live. The name suggested theatre, performance, the bright lights, and the big stage. It suggested a life lived fully and unapologetically, in the spotlight, at the centre of attention, with no interest whatsoever in blending into the background. But behind that nickname, behind the confidence and the style and the late nights and the magazine covers, there was a football player of extraordinary, almost frightening ability. There was a right arm that could throw a football 60 yards through the Miami air with a flick of the wrist, an emotion so fluid it barely looked like exertion. There was a release so quick that defensive backs could not react to it, the ball already in the air and on its way to the receiver before the defender had even broken on the route. There was a football mind that could read a defense before the snap, that could process the movements of 21 other men on the field in a fraction of a second and find the one opening, the one vulnerability, the one path to a completion. There was a competitor whose willingness to absorb punishment in the pocket, to stand tall with 260-pound defenders bearing down on him, bordered on the reckless and touched the edge of the heroic. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Joe Namath matters, not just to the history of the National Football League, but to the broader story of American sports and American culture in the second half of the 20th century. You are going to understand how a single guarantee, spoken at a banquet dinner in Miami in January of 1969, became the hinge upon which an entire sport turned. You are going to understand the price Namath paid for his brilliance and his fame, a price measured in scalpels and scars and decades of chronic pain. You are going to understand the man behind the legend, a man more complicated, more vulnerable, and more courageous than the mythology suggests. And you are going to understand why, more than half a century after that finger was raised to the sky, we are still talking about Joseph William Namath from Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let's begin. To understand what Joe Namath meant to football and to America, you first have to understand what football meant to America. And to understand that, you have to pull back and look at the larger picture, the way the sport of professional football became intertwined with the identity of a nation, how it reflected the country's values, its tensions, its ambitions, and its contradictions. Because football in the 1960s was not just a game, it was a mirror. And the reflection it showed was of a country in the middle of the most turbulent decade it had experienced since the Civil War. Football did not start as America's game. For most of the early 20th century, that title belonged to baseball. Baseball was the national pastime, the sport of lazy summer afternoons and crackling radio broadcasts, of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio, of sandlots and Sunday doubleheaders and fathers, teaching sons how to keep a scorecard. Professional football, by contrast, was a rough and ragged thing, played in small cities by men who held other jobs during the week. The National Football League was founded in 1920 in a car dealership in Canton, Ohio, and for decades it struggled to find its footing in the American consciousness. The players were tough but largely anonymous. The stadiums were often half empty. The money was modest at best. The idea that professional football would someday surpass baseball as the country's dominant sport would have seemed laughable to anyone paying attention in the 1930s or 40s. But something began to shift after the Second World War. America was changing in fundamental ways. The country that emerged from that conflict was restless and ambitious, hungry for new forms of entertainment, new ways to spend its expanding leisure time. Suburbs were spreading across the landscape. The middle class was growing, disposable income was rising, and into this environment came a technology that would reshape American culture more profoundly than almost any other invention of the 20th century. Television arrived in living rooms across the nation, and with it came the possibility of broadcasting sporting events to millions of people simultaneously. Baseball, with its slow pace and long silences, its meditative rhythms and extended pauses between moments of action, translated awkwardly to the small screen. The camera could not capture the full sweep of the diamond. The intervals between pitches tested the patience of viewers accustomed to the faster pace of other programming. Football, by contrast, turned out to be made for television. The violence was visceral and immediate. The strategy was layered and fascinating. The bursts of action were perfectly suited to the commercial breaks that funded the networks. And the field, rectangular and clearly defined, fit the dimensions of a television screen as if it had been designed for that purpose. The 1958 championship game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants is often cited as the moment professional football announced itself to the American public. That game, played at Yankee Stadium on a cold December afternoon and broadcast nationally on NBC, went to sudden death overtime, the first time that had ever happened in a championship contest. Johnny Unitas, the crew-cut quarterback from Pittsburgh, who had been cut by his first professional team and had to play semi-professional football for $6 a game before getting another chance, led the Colts down the field in the gathering darkness. When Alan Ameche plunged into the end zone for the winning touchdown, an estimated 45 million Americans were watching on their television sets at home. It was the largest audience that had ever watched a professional football game, and by some accounts, the largest audience for any sporting event in American history up to that point. Sports writers would later call it the greatest game ever played, and it changed the trajectory of professional football forever. From that moment forward, the NFL began its ascent toward cultural dominance. Television contracts grew larger with each passing year. Attendance at games swelled as the sport gained new fans by the millions. New franchises were added to the league. The organization that had once been a sideshow to college football and baseball was becoming a genuine cultural institution, a central part of the American weekend, a shared experience that brought families and communities together in a way that few other things could. Pete Rozelle understood this transformation better than anyone. When he became commissioner of the NFL in 1960, at the astonishingly young age of 33, he brought to the position a vision that was equal parts sports administration and show business. Rozelle had worked in public relations before joining the league office, and he understood instinctively that professional football was as much about marketing and image as it was about what happened between the white lines on Sunday afternoons. He negotiated league-wide television deals that ensured every team, regardless of market size, shared equally in the broadcast revenue. This was a revolutionary concept, one that gave small market teams in Green Bay and Pittsburgh the financial stability to compete with big market franchises in New York and Chicago. He marketed the league's stars as national celebrities, understanding that fans needed faces and personalities to connect with, not just teams and statistics. He turned the championship game into an event that transcended sport, a spectacle that demanded the attention of the entire nation. But even as the NFL was growing into a powerhouse, a rival was emerging. The American Football League was founded in 1960 by a group of wealthy businessmen who had been denied NFL franchises and decided to create their own league rather than accept rejection. The AFL was brash, ambitious, and willing to do things the older, more conservative NFL would never have considered. It played a wide-open, pass-happy style of football that prioritized entertainment and excitement over the grinding run-first philosophy that dominated the NFL. It put teams in cities the NFL had ignored or abandoned, places like Denver, Oakland, Houston, Buffalo, and San Diego. It signed players the NFL had overlooked or undervalued. It embraced African American players more readily than the older league, giving opportunities to talented athletes who might otherwise have been passed over. and it went to war with the NFL for talent, offering enormous contracts to lure top draft picks away from established teams. The NFL establishment viewed the AFL with barely concealed contempt. The older league had decades of tradition, storied franchises, bigger stadiums, more famous players, and far more television revenue. NFL owners and coaches and players referred to the AFL as a Mickey Mouse League, a collection of second-rate teams playing an inferior brand of football in half-empty stadiums. The disdain was pervasive and deeply felt. When the leagues finally agreed to a merger in 1966 and began staging an annual championship game between their respective champions, the NFL's Green Bay Packers won the first two of those games with ease. The great Vince Lombardi's Packers, a team that had come to symbolize everything the NFL stood for, discipline, toughness, excellence, teamwork, dismantled the AFL's Kansas City Chiefs 35-10 in the first game and then defeated the Oakland Raiders 30-14 in the second. The message from the NFL seemed clear and unambiguous. The AFL was the junior varsity. The NFL was where the real players played. The merger was a formality, a business arrangement, not a union of equals. This was the world into which Joe Namath stepped when he signed with the New York Jets in 1965, and this was the context that made his guarantee before Super Bowl III so explosive, so audacious, and ultimately so transformative. He was not simply predicting the outcome of a football game. He was challenging the established order of professional sports. But the cultural significance of football in the 1960s extended far beyond the rivalry between two leagues. America in that decade was a nation at war with itself in ways that had not been seen since the 1860s. The civil rights movement was reshaping the South and challenging the conscience of the entire country. The Vietnam War was tearing the nation apart, sending young men to die in a jungle halfway around the world for reasons that fewer and fewer Americans could articulate or defend. Assassinations had claimed the lives of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, his brother Robert in Los Angeles, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis. Cities burned in the aftermath of King's murder. Students occupied university buildings and clashed with police in the streets. The old certainties of the post-war era, the belief in American righteousness, in institutional authority, in the unquestioned wisdom of the older generation, were crumbling, and in their place arose a new culture of rebellion, individualism, defiance, and questioning. Football occupied a peculiar position in this cultural upheaval. The sport's traditional values, discipline, teamwork, sacrifice, obedience to authority, hierarchy, conformity, were the values of the old order. They were the values of the military, of the corporation, of the institutions that the counterculture was rebelling against. Coaches like Lombardi and Paul Brown and Tom Landry ran their teams like military units, demanding absolute obedience and punishing any deviation from the established norms. Players were expected to keep their hair short, their opinions private, their personal lives invisible. Football was a conservative sport in a conservative America, a game that celebrated the very virtues the younger generation was questioning. And then along came Joe Namath, and he did not fit the mold. He did not look like other quarterbacks. He did not act like other quarterbacks. He did not behave the way professional athletes were supposed to behave. He wore his hair long, past his ears, at a time when most football players kept theirs trimmed to military specifications. He grew thick sideburns that framed his face like a rock star's. He wore white shoes on the football field, a small act of vanity that in the rigidly conformist world of 1960s professional football felt like an act of open rebellion. He stayed out late at night, frequenting the bars and nightclubs of Manhattan. He owned a bar himself, a place called Bachelor's 3 on the Upper East Side that became one of the most famous gathering spots in New York City. He dated models and actresses and beauty queens. He appeared on television talk shows and magazine covers and spoke with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, or what the older generation would have called arrogance, but what the younger generation recognized as something else entirely. It was authenticity. It was a refusal to perform the kind of false modesty that athletes had been expected to display for decades. In another era, this might have been unremarkable. But in the late 1960s, in a sport that prized conformity and obedience above all else, Namath was a revolution in cleats. He was the counterculture's quarterback, even though he never consciously claimed that title for himself. He was not a political activist. He did not march in protests or make speeches about the war or align himself with any particular movement. He was simply being who he was, a young man from a tough background who had extraordinary talent and saw no reason to hide his personality, his appetites, or his enjoyment of the life that his talent had made possible. But in the context of that specific moment in American history, his style and swagger took on a meaning larger than anything he had intended. He represented something new in the world of professional sports. He represented the idea that an athlete could be brilliant and rebellious at the same time, that discipline on the field did not require submission of it, that a man could be the best at what he did and still be unapologetically, defiantly himself. The NFL's relationship with television deepened and intensified throughout the 1960s, and this relationship transformed the way Americans consumed not just football, but all of professional sports. The advent of instant replay, first used in a CBS broadcast of an Army-Navy game in 1963, changed the viewer's experience fundamentally and permanently. Suddenly, a great play could be watched again, slowed down, dissected, appreciated from multiple angles. The slow-motion close-up turned football players into something more than athletes. It turned them into performers, into characters in a drama, their every facial expression captured, their every moment of triumph or defeat magnified and replayed and analyzed. The television camera was not neutral. It was a storytelling device, and it needed stories to tell. It needed heroes and villains, underdogs and favorites, moments of crisis and moments of redemption. This was the world that was waiting for Joe Namath, a world where a charismatic quarterback with a cannon for an arm and an instinct for self-promotion could become not just a sports star, but a genuine cultural icon. Television needed faces, personalities, characters who could fill the screen with their presence, and Namath had a face that the camera loved and a personality that was impossible to ignore. Television needed drama, and Namath was a man who seemed to generate drama simply by walking into a room, simply by opening his mouth, simply by existing in a world that did not know quite what to make of him. Professional football's cultural footprint in the 1960s was also shaped by the sport's complex and often painful relationship with race. The NFL had been integrated since 1946, when the Los Angeles Rams signed Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, breaking a color barrier that had stood since the early 1930s. But integration was slow, uneven, and deeply imperfect. Black players faced discrimination both on and off the field that was pervasive and often humiliating. They were frequently channeled into certain positions: running back, wide receiver, defensive back, cornerback, while the so-called thinking positions, quarterback, center, middle linebacker, remained overwhelmingly white. This practice, known as stacking, reflected broader racial assumptions about intelligence, leadership, and the capacity for complex decision-making that pervaded American society. Hotels in certain cities refused to accommodate black players during road trips. Restaurants turned them away. Fans subjected them to abuse. The progress was real, genuine, and significant, but it was incomplete, and the gaps between what the sport promised and what it delivered were a source of constant friction. The AFL, to its lasting credit, was generally more welcoming and inclusive toward black players than the established NFL. The newer league could not afford to be as selective or as prejudiced. It needed talent wherever it could find it, regardless of the color of the player's skin, and it was willing to give opportunities to athletes the NFL had dismissed or undervalued. This openness helped the AFL develop some of the most exciting and dynamic players of the era, and contributed to the wide-open, entertaining, high-scoring style of play that became the league's trademark and calling card. Namath's own racial attitudes were shaped by two formative experiences. First, by his upbringing in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, a diverse mill town where he grew up playing alongside black teammates and where racial boundaries, while certainly present, were less rigidly enforced than in many other parts of the country. Second, by his time at the University of Alabama, where he witnessed the early stages of integration in the Deep South, and where the tensions of the civil rights movement were felt with particular intensity. He was, by all accounts, and by the testimony of his teammates and contemporaries, genuinely colorblind in his friendships and in his evaluation of the men he played with and against. This may seem like a small thing from the vantage point of the 21st century, but in the context of the 1960s, it was quietly significant. The quarterback was the leader of the team, the man who called the plays, who commanded the huddle, who was expected to inspire and direct 10 other men in the heat of competition. For that man to treat every teammate as an equal, to judge them solely on their ability and their character rather than the color of their skin, sent a message that resonated far beyond the football field. The rise of professional football in the 60s also coincided with the emergence of a new and more aggressive kind of sports journalism. The old school of sports writing, which had treated athletes with almost reverential respect, which had looked the other way when players drank too much or behaved badly, which had maintained a gentleman's agreement to protect the private lives of public figures, was giving way to a more confrontational, more personal, more intrusive style. A new generation of reporters wanted access, not just to the locker room, but to the lives of the men who played the game. They wanted to know about the drinking, the womanizing, the fears, the rivalries, the pain, the human reality behind the helmets and the pads. And Namath, who was nothing if not candid, who seemed constitutionally incapable of dissembling or performing the kind of polished media interactions that other athletes had mastered, gave these new reporters material that their editors could hardly believe. He once told a reporter, with characteristic directness, that he preferred spending time with women over preparing game film. He showed up to events in fur coats and flashy suits that would have been more appropriate on a nightclub stage than in a football stadium. He made no apologies for enjoying his fame, his money, his youth, or his attractiveness. In an era when professional athletes were still expected to present a wholesome, family-friendly image, when they were supposed to be role models for children and ambassadors for their sport, Namath was unapologetically, almost aggressively himself, and the American public responded to him with an intensity that surprised even the people who had orchestrated his rise to fame. Not all of the public loved him, certainly. There were millions of Americans who viewed Namath with suspicion, with resentment, or with outright hostility, who saw in him everything they believed was wrong with the younger generation, its self-indulgence, its disrespect for tradition, its refusal to play by the rules that had governed American life for generations. But to millions of others, particularly to young people who were searching for alternatives to the stiff, buttoned-up models of manhood that their parents' generation had offered them, Namath was thrilling. He was real. He was alive in a way that other athletes, with their practiced humility and their careful public personas, simply were not. The merger between the AFL and NFL, agreed upon in 1966 but not scheduled for full implementation until 1970, created the framework for what would eventually become the most powerful and profitable sports league in the world. But before that merger could be completed, before the two leagues could be formally joined into a single entity with a unified schedule and a single championship, there was the matter of those annual championship games between the AFL and NFL champions. The first two had been dominated by the NFL with such thoroughness that many observers questioned whether the championship game itself was even worth playing. The Packers had been so clearly superior to their AFL opponents that the games had barely qualified as competitive. The conventional wisdom held that this disparity was simply the natural order of things, that the AFL was improving year by year but was still several seasons away from being able to compete at the highest level with the NFL's elite teams. The idea that an AFL team could actually defeat an NFL champion was considered not just unlikely but borderline delusional. It was in this atmosphere of condescension and dismissal that Joe Namath and the New York Jets prepared to face the Baltimore Colts in the third of these championship contests, the game that would come to be known as Super Bowl III. The cultural context matters enormously because it helps explain why Namath's guarantee before that game resonated so deeply and enduringly with the American public. It was not simply a bold prediction about a football game. It was an act of defiance against an established order that had declared one group of athletes fundamentally inferior to another. It was a young man from the less prestigious league standing up and telling the world that the experts were wrong, that the conventional wisdom was flawed, that the gap between the two leagues existed more in perception than in reality. In a decade defined by acts of defiance, by young people challenging the authority of institutions they considered unjust or outdated, by individuals refusing to accept the judgments of those who claimed to know better, Namath's guarantee was a near-perfect expression of the spirit of the age. He was not asking for permission. He was not expressing a hope. He was stating a fact that had not yet happened, and he was daring anyone in the world to prove him wrong. The television networks understood the narrative power of this moment, even if they did not fully appreciate its historical significance at the time. NBC, which broadcast the game, framed the contest as David versus Goliath, as the upstart challenger taking on the unassailable champion. The pre-game coverage focused heavily on the point spread, on the overwhelming consensus among football experts that the Colts would win easily, and of course on Namath's guarantee, which provided exactly the kind of dramatic tension that television required. The cameras lingered on Namath's face during warm-ups, searching for signs of doubt or nervousness, and finding instead the same relaxed confidence that had characterized everything he had done since arriving in professional football. This was the cultural landscape of American football in the late 1960s, a sport on the verge of surpassing baseball as the nation's dominant form of entertainment. A bitter rivalry between two leagues that was about far more than football, that was about legitimacy, about respect, about who had the right to claim the title of champion. A country in turmoil divided along lines of generation, race, class, and ideology, searching for new heroes and new narratives to make sense of a world that seemed to be changing faster than anyone could process. And into this landscape stepped a young quarterback from western Pennsylvania with damaged knees, a golden arm, and a mouth that would change the game forever. And there was something else happening in America in the late 1960s that would prove critical to the story of Joe Namath and the Super Bowl. The country was developing a hunger for spectacle, for events that could command the attention of the entire nation simultaneously. In an era before the internet, before cable television offered hundreds of channels, before streaming services fragmented audiences into ever smaller niches, the major television networks had the power to create shared national experiences in a way that seems almost unimaginable today. When a program aired on NBC or CBS or ABC, tens of millions of Americans watched it together in real time and talked about it the next day at work or school or church. A football game broadcast on national television was not just a sporting event. It was a communal ritual, a moment when the entire country paused to watch the same thing, to share the same emotions, to participate in the same narrative. And when that football game carried the additional weight of a guarantee from the most famous and controversial athlete in the country, the communal experience became something even more potent. It became the kind of moment that defines an era, that becomes a reference point for an entire generation, that people remember not just for what happened, but for where they were when it happened, and who they were with, and what it felt like to watch it unfold. The stage was set, the characters were in place, and the moment that would define Joe Namath's life and reshape the future of professional football in America was approaching with the certainty of a clock running down to zero. Joseph William Namath was born on May 31st, 1943, in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, a small industrial town about 30 miles northwest of Pittsburgh, nestled along the banks of the Beaver River. In those days, Beaver Falls was the kind of place that existed in almost every corner of western Pennsylvania, a mill town built around the production of steel and the labors of the men who made it. Smokestacks lined the riverbank, belching thick plumes of grey and white smoke into skies that rarely seemed to clear entirely. The air carried the sharp, acrid smell of molten metal and burning coke. The streets were lined with modest houses, the kind with small front porches and narrow yards, homes built for function rather than beauty, homes built for families who measured their wealth not in dollars, but in the steadiness of a paycheck and the soundness of a roof. Joe was the youngest of 5 children born to John and Rose Namath, a couple of Hungarian descent whose families had come to America, seeking the same thing that millions of other immigrants had sought before them: a chance at a life that was better, or at least more stable, than the one they had left behind. John Namath worked in the steel mills, as so many men in Beaver Falls did. He rose before dawn and came home after dark, his hands rough and calloused, his clothes carrying the smell of the mill. The work was hard, dangerous, and relentless, and it paid just enough to keep a family fed and sheltered, but rarely more than that. Rose kept the household running, managing the children, stretching the budget, maintaining the routines and rhythms of a working-class family in a working-class town. The marriage between John and Rose was not a happy one, and they divorced when Joe was still a young boy. The separation was painful, as divorces always are, but particularly so in a small town where family structures were expected to hold together regardless of the difficulties within them. Rose remarried a man named Linwood Namath, who stepped into the role of stepfather and became a steady, dependable presence in Joe's life. The reconstituted household was loving if not luxurious, warm if not wealthy. Money was always tight. New clothes were a rarity. Vacations were unheard of. The children learned early that life in Beaver Falls was not about comfort or privilege. It was about work, about endurance, about making do with what you had, and not complaining about what you did not. But there was one thing that Beaver Falls had in abundance, one thing that could make even the greyest mill town feel electric with possibility, and that was sports. In the industrial towns of western Pennsylvania, sports were not simply recreation. They were not merely a way to pass the time on a Saturday afternoon. They were something far more significant, more urgent, more deeply felt. They were a way out. Every kid who grew up in those towns, who played on those rocky fields and cracked asphalt courts, knew the stories of local boys who had made it to the big time, who had turned athletic talent into a ticket to a life that their parents could never have imagined. Joe Montana would come from Monongahela, Dan Marino would come from Pittsburgh, Jim Kelly would come from East Brady. Johnny Unitas had come from Pittsburgh before them all. Western Pennsylvania was a factory for football talent, a region that seemed to produce quarterbacks the way its mills produced steel, with a relentless, almost mechanical efficiency. Joe Namath was a product of that tradition, and from an early age, it was clear that he possessed athletic gifts that set him apart from even the most talented of his peers. He was fast, with the kind of natural speed that cannot be taught or developed but only discovered. He was coordinated, with an innate sense of where his body was in space and how to move it with maximum efficiency. He was fiercely, almost unreasonably competitive, a kid who hated to lose at anything, whether it was in a football game, or a game of cards, or a race to the end of the block. He played every sport available to him, excelling in football, basketball, and baseball with equal ease, displaying the kind of all-around athletic versatility that made coaches shake their heads in admiration and wonder. But it was his arm that truly set him apart from everyone else. Even as a teenager at Beaver Falls High School, Joe Namath could throw a football with a velocity, accuracy, and effortlessness that coaches and scouts had rarely, if ever, seen in a player so young. His release was remarkably quick, a compact motion that began at his ear and ended with the ball spiraling tight and true through the air, arriving in the receiver's hands before the defender could react, before the defender could even process what had happened. The ball seemed to leap from his hand, as if propelled by something other than human muscle, as if the arm and the ball had reached some kind of agreement about where the ball needed to go and how quickly it needed to get there. Other quarterbacks threw the football. Namath launched it, and the difference was visible to anyone who watched him play, even for a single series of downs. By his senior year at Beaver Falls High School, Namath was one of the most heavily recruited high school athletes in the entire country. Colleges from across the nation dispatched recruiters to western Pennsylvania to watch him play, to meet him, to court him, to try to convince him that their program was the right place for his talents. He had scholarship offers from major football programs in every conference. Several professional baseball teams including the Chicago Cubs, expressed serious interest in signing him directly out of high school. The decision he faced was one that would shape the trajectory of his entire life, and he made it with the same directness and certainty that would later define his public persona. He chose football, and he chose the University of Alabama. This was 1961, and the choice of Alabama was as significant in its way as the choice of football. Alabama was the Deep South, a world as different from Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, as any place in America could be. The civil rights movement was gathering force across the South, and the state of Alabama was one of its most fiercely contested battlegrounds. Bull Connor would soon turn fire hoses and police dogs on peaceful demonstrators in Birmingham. Governor George Wallace would stand in a schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama itself, attempting to block the enrollment of black students in a theatrical display of defiance that would become one of the most iconic images of the civil rights struggle. Freedom riders had been beaten, burned, and bombed on Alabama highways just months before Namath's arrival. For a kid from a relatively diverse mill town in western Pennsylvania, a kid who had grown up playing alongside black teammates and neighbors, the racial dynamics of Alabama in the early 1960s were jarring, unsettling, and profoundly educational. But Alabama also had Paul William Bryant, known to the world as Bear, and Bear Bryant was the reason Joe Namath went south. Bryant was already a living legend. By the time Namath arrived on the campus in Tuscaloosa, he wore his trademark houndstooth hat at a rakish angle, prowled the sidelines with a commanding physical presence that seemed to fill the entire stadium, and ran a football program built on a foundation of discipline, toughness, attention to detail, and an absolute unyielding insistence on winning. Bryant did not tolerate excuses from his players. He did not tolerate laziness. He did not tolerate self-pity or complaint. He did not tolerate anything less than total, unconditional commitment to the team and to the pursuit of victory. Players who could not meet his standards were invited to leave. Players who would not meet them were shown the door. The ones who remained, the ones who survived the grueling practices, the relentless physical and psychological demands, the constant pressure to improve and to perform, those players became something more than athletes. They became part of a tradition, part of a legacy, part of something larger than themselves. Namath was everything that Bryant admired in a football player, and everything that drove the old coach to distraction, often within the space of a single afternoon. The kid from Beaver Falls had more raw football talent than anyone Bryant had ever coached. Bryant had coached many great players over a career that spanned decades. Namath's arm was extraordinary, a weapon of such precision and power that it seemed to belong to a different era of the sport, an era that had not yet arrived. His instincts on the football field were razor-sharp, honed by years of playing every sport imaginable, by a lifetime of reading and reacting to the movements of opponents and teammates. He could read a defense before the snap of the ball, identify the weakness in the coverage, adjust the play at the line of scrimmage, and deliver the football to the exact spot where it needed to be, all within the space of a few heartbeats. Bryant recognized immediately that Namath was a once-in-a-generation talent, the kind of player who comes along only a handful of times in a coach's career, the kind of player who can transform a good team into a great one simply by taking the field. But Namath was also headstrong, undisciplined, and constitutionally incapable of following rules that he considered arbitrary or unreasonable. He broke curfew regularly, staying out late in Tuscaloosa's limited, but not entirely absent nightlife. He drank, which was explicitly forbidden. He pushed against the rigid structure that Bryant imposed on his players in ways that no one else on the team dared to attempt. He was not openly disrespectful to Bryant, at least not in the way that would have warranted immediate expulsion from the program, but he tested boundaries with a persistence and a creativity that suggested he viewed the rules not as commandments but as suggestions, not as walls but as fences that could be climbed if the mood struck him. Bryant faced a dilemma that coaches throughout the history of sports have faced when blessed with a generational talent who refuses to color inside the lines. How much do you tolerate from a player whose talent can win games that no one else can win? How far do you bend your rules before they break entirely? How do you maintain discipline and order on a team of dozens of young men when the most gifted among them is openly flouting the standards that everyone else is required to uphold? These are questions that have no easy answers, and they are questions that Bryant wrestled with throughout Namath's time at Alabama. Bryant's ultimate answer was to suspend Namath before the final regular season game of the 1963 season, and for the Sugar Bowl that followed. The suspension was for violating team rules, the specifics of which were never fully disclosed but were widely understood to involve drinking and breaking curfew. The punishment was significant, both for what it cost Namath, who missed 2 important games during his junior year, and for the message it sent to the rest of the team. No one was above the program. No one, regardless of talent, was exempt from the consequences of breaking the rules. Namath accepted the punishment without public complaint, served his suspension, and returned for his senior season in the fall of 1964 with what appeared to be a renewed commitment to the team and to the standards that Bryant demanded. The suspension had another consequence, one that was less obvious at the time, but would prove significant in the years to come. It established a pattern in Namath's life, a pattern of extraordinary talent existing in tension with a refusal to conform, of brilliance on the field accompanied by complications of it. Bryant handled the situation with the same combination of firmness and affection that characterized his approach to all of his players. Years later, he would say that Namath was the best athlete he ever coached, and that coaching him was like trying to harness a hurricane. You could direct it, to a degree. You could channel its energy, but you could never fully control it. And if you tried too hard, you would destroy the very thing that made it magnificent. The relationship between Bryant and Namath was one of the most fascinating and consequential in the history of college football. Bryant was the ultimate authority figure, a man who demanded absolute obedience and who had built a dynasty on the principle that the team was always more important than any individual. Namath was the ultimate individual, a young man whose talent was so vast and whose personality was so vivid that he could not help but stand out, could not help but be different, could not help but be noticed. The tension between these two forces, between institutional discipline and individual expression, would play out not just at Alabama, but throughout Namath's entire career. It was the central drama of his life, the friction that generated both his greatest triumphs and his most painful struggles. That senior season was both brilliant and heartbreaking, a microcosm of the contradictions that would define Namath's entire career. Alabama went undefeated in the regular season, rolling through its schedule with a dominance that left little doubt about the program's status as one of the best in college football. Namath was magnificent. He led one of the most potent and exciting offenses in the country, throwing with a combination of power and touch that left opposing defenses bewildered and helpless. He could throw the deep ball, launching it 60 yards downfield, with a motion so smooth it looked casual. He could throw the short slant, firing the ball into a window between 2 defenders with a quickness and accuracy that seemed almost mechanical. He could throw the sideline out, the touch pass over the middle, the screen pass, the play-action fake, followed by the deep throw down the seam. He had every throw in the book, and he executed them all with a mastery that belied his youth. He made the game look easy, and in those moments when the pocket collapsed around him and the defensive ends bore down on him with violent intent, he showed a toughness and a willingness to absorb punishment that surprised those who had dismissed him as nothing more than a flashy, undisciplined talent. But Namath's knees were already beginning to betray him. He had injured his right knee during the season, a significant injury that in a later era might have required immediate surgery and a lengthy rehabilitation. In 1964, the medical options were more limited and the expectations of players were less forgiving. Namath played through the injury, or tried to, managing the pain with whatever treatments were available, and relying increasingly on his arm and his intelligence rather than his legs. By the time Alabama reached the Orange Bowl in January of 1965 to face the University of Texas for what many considered the national championship, Namath was playing on a leg that could barely support his weight. He wore a bulky knee brace that restricted his movement and telegraphed his limitations to every defender on the field. He played anyway. He played because that is about what Joe Namath did. He played because the idea of sitting on the sideline while his team took the field was simply incomprehensible to him. He played because his team needed him, because his coach needed him, because the moment was too large and too important to surrender to something as mundane as pain. Alabama lost that game 7-21, and the national championship that had seemed within reach slipped away. But Namath's courage in playing through an injury that would have sidelined most players only added to his growing legend. He had shown the world something that statistics and highlights cannot capture. He had shown them his heart. When the professional football draft arrived in the spring of 1965, Namath was the most coveted prospect in the country, the consensus #1 talent available to either league. Both the NFL and the AFL wanted him desperately, and the bidding war that ensued would become one of the most significant transactions in the history of professional sports. The NFL's Louis Cardinals held Namath's draft rights, having selected him in the first round. But the AFL's New York Jets, owned by the ambitious and media-savvy David Abraham Werblin, known to the world as Sonny, were willing to do whatever it took to sign the most exciting young quarterback in America. Werblin was a former entertainment executive who had represented actors and musicians before entering the world of professional sports, and he understood something about the business of football that many of his fellow owners did not. He understood that professional football was as much about entertainment, about spectacle, about putting on a show, as it was about blocking and tackling and winning games. He understood that a charismatic, handsome, impossibly talented young quarterback, playing in the media capital of the world, in the city with the most newspapers, the most television cameras, the most magazine writers, and the most demanding and sophisticated fan base in America, could transform the fortunes of not just a single franchise, but an entire league. He was willing to pay whatever was necessary to make that happen. Werblin signed Namath to a contract worth $427,000 over 3 years. In 1965, this was a staggering, almost incomprehensible sum of money. No professional football player had ever been paid anything remotely close to that amount. Star quarterbacks in the NFL were making $50,000 or $60,000 a year. The rookie contract offered to Namath was worth more than many veteran players had earned in their entire careers. The contract made national headlines and instantly transformed Namath from a talented college player into one of the most famous and talked about athletes in America before he had thrown a single pass in a professional game. The decision to sign with the AFL and the Jets, rather than the NFL and the Cardinals, was significant for reasons that extended far beyond the money. As enormous as the money was, by choosing the AFL over the NFL, by selecting the upstart league over the established one, Namath lent an enormous measure of credibility and star power to the younger league at a moment when it desperately needed both. If the best football player in America, the most talented quarterback to come out of college in years, chose to play in the AFL, then maybe the AFL was not the second-rate operation that NFL loyalists and sports writers had been claiming. Maybe it was a legitimate and worthy competitor. Maybe it was the future of professional football. And it gets harder when you consider what Namath was walking into in New York. The Jets had been a struggling franchise, playing in a cavernous and often empty Shea Stadium, overshadowed completely by the NFL's New York Giants, a team with deep roots in the city and a devoted, generational fan base. Namath was expected to change all of that by himself. He was expected to fill seats, generate excitement, win games, and compete for championships. He was 21 years old, playing on surgically repaired knees in the biggest and most demanding city in the world, with the weight of an entire league resting on his shoulders. He arrived in New York City in the spring of 1965 and immediately became a sensation that the city had not seen since the arrival of the Beatles at JFK Airport a year earlier. It was not just his football ability, though that was genuine, exceptional, and immediately apparent to anyone who watched him throw. It was his personality, his style, his absolute fearlessness in the face of the largest, most demanding, most unforgiving city in America. He moved into a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a bachelor pad, furnished with a white llama skin rug that became as famous as anything he did on the football field. He drove a Lincoln Continental convertible. He wore mink coats in public. He frequented the most exclusive nightclubs and restaurants in Manhattan. And everywhere he went, heads turned, cameras flashed, and people pressed close, wanting to be near him, wanting to touch the aura of confidence and charisma that surrounded him like an electrical field. The nickname came quickly and stuck permanently. Broadway Joe. Two words that captured everything about who he was and what he represented. The glamour of the Great White Way, the confidence of a leading man, the sense that this young quarterback from a Pennsylvania steel town was as much a performer as he was an athlete. He was Broadway Joe and New York City, that vast and indifferent metropolis that had broken so many who came to it seeking fame, opened its arms and embraced him. The nickname came quickly and stuck permanently. Broadway Joe. Two words that captured everything about who he was and what he represented. The glamour of the Great White Way, the confidence of a leading man, the sense that this young quarterback from a Pennsylvania steel town was as much a performer as he was an athlete. He was Broadway Joe and New York City, that vast and indifferent metropolis that had broken so many who came to it seeking fame, opened its arms and embraced him as if it had been waiting for him all along. Namath's first season with the Jets, 1965, was a baptism by fire. Professional football was faster, more violent, and more complex than the college game he had left behind. The defenses he faced were bigger, stronger, and more sophisticated than anything he had encountered at Alabama. The pass rushers hit harder and arrived faster. The defensive backs were quicker and more experienced. But Namath adapted with remarkable speed, displaying the football intelligence and the competitive fire that had made him a star in college. He threw for more than 2,000 yards in his rookie season and showed enough flashes of his potential to convince the Jets and their fans that the investment in him had been worthwhile. On the field, Namath was electric from his very first professional season. His arm was the most powerful and most accurate in professional football, a weapon that coaches and opposing defenders alike regarded with something approaching awe. He could throw the ball into the tightest windows, threading it between converging defenders with a precision that seemed almost surgical. He had what scouts and coaches call a quick release, the ability to get the ball out of his hand in a fraction of a second after deciding where to throw it. This was critical for Namath because his injured knees made him nearly immobile in the pocket. He could not run, he could not scramble. He could not extend plays with his feet the way other quarterbacks could. He had to stand in the pocket, read the defense, make his decision, and deliver the football before the pass rush arrived. And he had to do all of this on knees that were already deteriorating. He did it with a coolness, a calm, a complete indifference to the mayhem swirling around him that bordered on the supernatural. In his second professional season, 1966, Namath accomplished something that no professional quarterback had ever done. He threw for 4,007 yards in a single season, shattering the existing records and establishing a new standard for what was possible through the air. That number demands context to be fully appreciated. In the modern era of professional football, when the rules have been extensively rewritten to favor the passing game, when defensive backs are penalized for so much as looking at a receiver too aggressively, quarterbacks routinely throw for 4,000 yards and sometimes exceed 5,000. But in 1966, the passing game was far less developed. Defenses were allowed to hit receivers with impunity, to jam them at the line of scrimmage, to mug them in their routes. The rules overwhelmingly favored the defense. 4,000 yards was a number that seemed to belong to another sport entirely, a number so far beyond what anyone else had achieved that it was difficult to comprehend. Namath was the first in the AFL, the first in the NFL, the first in the history of professional football, and he did it on knees that required constant attention from trainers and team doctors, knees that were wrapped and braced and injected before every game. The Jets continued to improve around their young quarterback. Head coach Wee Bank, a quiet, methodical, unassuming man who had coached the Baltimore Colts to the famous 1958 championship game, was building a roster designed to complement Namath's extraordinary passing ability. Wide receivers Don Maynard and George Sauer gave Namath fast, reliable targets. The offensive line grew stronger and more cohesive. The defense, led by fierce competitors like Jerry Philbin, John Elliott, and the veteran Johnny Sample, became one of the most formidable units in the AFL. By the 1968 season, the pieces had come together in a way that felt almost destined. The Jets finished the regular season with an 11-3 record, the best in franchise history, a record that validated every decision Eubank had made in building his roster and every dollar Werblin had spent in signing his quarterback. Namath was not the statistical monster he had been in '66, when he threw for those record-breaking 4,000 yards, but he was a more complete, more refined, and more mature quarterback. He had learned the art of game management, the discipline of taking what the defense offered rather than always trying to force the spectacular throw into the narrow window. He threw for 3,147 yards that season with 15 touchdowns. The numbers were excellent, but they did not tell the full story of his growth. He had learned when to be patient and when to be aggressive, when to check down to the short receiver, and when to unleash the deep ball. He had learned how to lead, not through speeches or demonstrations of emotion, but through the quiet, consistent excellence of his play. He was still Broadway Joe off the field, still living the high life in Manhattan, still generating headlines with his social calendar and his outspoken opinions. But on the field, between the white lines, he had become a complete professional, a quarterback whose teammates believed in him with a conviction that bordered on faith. The Jets won the AFL Championship by defeating the Oakland Raiders in a convincing and cathartic victory, and their reward was a trip to Super Bowl III in Miami, Florida, where they would face the champions of the National Football League, the mighty Baltimore Colts. To call the Colts a formidable opponent would be a profound understatement. They were considered by many observers, both casual fans and the most seasoned expert analysts in the sport, to be one of the greatest teams in the history of professional football, a team so talented and so complete that comparisons to the legendary Packers of Lombardy were not merely permissible but inevitable. They had finished the regular season with a staggering 13-1 record, losing only to the Cleveland Browns in a game that most experts dismissed as an aberration. Their defense was among the most suffocating in the sport, a unit that had allowed fewer points than almost any defense in NFL history. They pressured quarterbacks relentlessly, forced turnovers consistently, and shut down opposing offenses with a systematic ruthlessness that was deeply unsettling to watch. Their quarterback, Earl Morrall, who had stepped into the starting role after a preseason injury to the legendary Johnny Unitas, had played so brilliantly during the regular season that he had been named the league's most valuable player, an honor that seemed to confirm that the Colts were a team of destiny, a team so deep and so talented that they could lose the greatest quarterback in NFL history and still dominate the league. Their head coach, the young and brilliant Don Shula, who would later become the winningest coach in the history of professional football, was regarded as one of the finest tactical and strategic minds in the sport. And behind Morrall, waiting on the sideline with the patience and the quiet confidence that had defined his legendary career, was Unitas himself, healthy, rested, and ready to play if circumstances demanded his presence. The odds makers made the Colts an 18-point favorite, 18 points. In football, that is not a prediction of victory. That is a prediction of complete and total annihilation. It is a line that says the game is not worth playing, that the outcome is a foregone conclusion, that one team is so vastly superior to the other that genuine competition is impossible. No one outside the Jets' own locker room gave them a realistic chance of winning the game. The NFL had dominated the first two Super Bowls so thoroughly that many people viewed the annual contest as an exhibition rather than a championship. The Jets, for all their improvement under Eubank and Namath, were still an AFL team, and AFL teams simply did not compete with the best of the NFL. That was the accepted wisdom. That was the consensus. That was what everyone believed. But Joe Namath had other ideas. He had watched the film. He had studied the Colts' defense with the same obsessive attention to detail that had made him great at Alabama, and that had carried him through 4 seasons as a professional. He had identified weaknesses that others had missed, tendencies that could be exploited, patterns that could be attacked. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in that place where confidence and preparation and competitive fire converge to produce something that looks, from the outside, like either genius or madness, he had already decided how this story was going to end. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. It is not simply that Namath believed the Jets could win. Athletes believe in themselves all the time. It is that he told the world he believed it, publicly on the record, with no escape route and no hedge. And then he went out and proved himself right. What happened next would change the course of professional football forever. 3 days before the game, on the evening of Thursday, January 9th, 1969, Joe Namath stood at a podium in a banquet hall at the Miami Touchdown Club. He was there to accept an award as the Outstanding Professional Football Player of the Year, a recognition that itself was remarkable given that the award traditionally went to NFL players, not men from the rival AFL. The room was filled with reporters, broadcasters, football dignitaries, and the kind of well-connected insiders who populated the world of professional sports in that era. The drinks were flowing, the conversation was loud, and the prevailing mood in the room, as it was throughout the sporting world that week, was one of anticipation tinged with the certainty that the Baltimore Colts were about to administer a severe and humiliating beating to Joe Namath and his New York Jets. A heckler in the crowd, emboldened by alcohol and the comfort of conventional wisdom, shouted at Namath that the Colts were going to destroy him and his team. The heckler's words were not unusual. Everyone in Miami that week was saying the same thing in bars and hotel lobbies and press conferences and everywhere else that football people gathered. The Colts were 18-point favorites. The outcome was considered a foregone conclusion. The only real question was how badly the Jets would lose. Namath looked at the heckler. He paused, and then he said, calmly and clearly, in a voice that carried across the banquet hall and would soon carry across the entire country, words that would echo through the decades, words that would become among the most famous ever spoken by an American athlete. He guaranteed a victory. He said that the New York Jets would win Super Bowl III. He guaranteed it. The room went silent for a moment, the kind of silence that falls when someone says something so unexpected, so audacious, so seemingly disconnected from reality, that the listeners need a moment to process what they have heard. And then the room erupted. Laughter, mostly. Disbelief. A few shouts of encouragement from Jets supporters. But overwhelmingly, the reaction was one of amused incredulity. An AFL quarterback, representing a league that had been humiliated in the first 2 Super Bowls, a league that the NFL establishment regarded with barely concealed contempt, was standing in a room full of people who were absolutely certain he was about to be embarrassed on the biggest stage in professional football, and he was telling them they were wrong, not suggesting that an upset was possible, not expressing confidence in his team's chances, guaranteeing a victory. The audacity of the statement was almost beyond comprehension. The guarantee dominated the national sports conversation in the days leading up to the game. Newspapers from coast to coast ran it as a front-page headline. Television commentators discussed it with a mixture of amusement, bemusement, and outright disbelief. Some admired Namath's confidence, even if they thought it was misplaced. Others were appalled by what they considered a breathtaking display of arrogance from a young man who was about to learn a very painful and very public lesson. Most analysts agreed on one thing. Namath had given the Colts bulletin board material additional motivation for a team that was already the most dominant in football. His guarantee, they predicted, would only make the beating more severe. But what the commentators and the analysts and the bookmakers did not know, what they could not have known, because they had not done the work that Namath had done, was that the guarantee was not born of blind arrogance or youthful bravado. It was born of preparation. Namath had spent weeks studying game film of the Baltimore Colts, and he had seen things that other people had missed or dismissed. He had studied the Colts' defensive secondary and identified patterns in their coverage that he believed could be exploited with quick, precise throws to the outside. He had watched Earl Morrall and concluded that the NFL's most valuable player was a capable quarterback who had benefited from an exceptional supporting cast, but who was not the kind of player who could carry a team when things went wrong, not the kind of quarterback who could improvise when the game plan fell apart. He had analyzed the Colts' pass rush and determined that the Jets' offensive line could handle it. He had reviewed the matchups, the tendencies, the strengths and weaknesses of every unit on the Baltimore roster, and he had arrived at a conclusion that no one else in America shared. He believed the Jets were the better team. He believed they would win, and being Joe Namath, he said so. Super Bowl III was played on Sunday, January 12, 1969, at the Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida. The temperature was warm and pleasant, the sky clear and blue, the kind of perfect January day that reminded everyone why Florida had become the host state for the biggest game in football. The stadium was filled with just over 75,000 fans, many of whom had paid the then exorbitant price of $12 for the best seats in the house. Most of those fans expected to watch a Colts rout. The pre-game atmosphere was festive, but tinged with a sense of inevitability. The smart money, all of it, was on Baltimore. The early moments of the game seemed to confirm what everyone expected. The Colts received the opening kickoff and began to move the ball with the confidence and precision of a team that had been the best in its league all season long. Their running backs hit the holes with authority. Their receivers ran crisp routes. The Jets' defense, which had been dismissed by most NFL observers as an AFL afterthought, a unit that might have been adequate against inferior competition, but that would surely wilt against the power and sophistication of the NFL's finest offense, bent but did not break on that opening drive. And then something unexpected happened, something that no one outside the Jets' own locker room had predicted or even considered possible. The Jets' defense began to play with a ferocity, a discipline, and an intelligence that stunned the Colts, stunned the crowd, stunned the television audience, and stunned the football world. They rushed Morrall with a relentless aggression that disrupted his timing and forced him into hurried throws. They dropped into coverage with a precision that took away his favorite targets and closed the passing lanes he had exploited all season long. They tackled with a violence and a certainty that stopped the Colts' running game at the line of scrimmage and denied Baltimore the ball control offense that was essential to their game plan. Morrall, who had been so brilliantly efficient during the regular season, who had thrown 26 touchdown passes and led the Colts to 13 victories in 14 games, was rattled. The poised, confident quarterback who had earned the league's Most Valuable Player award was making mistakes. Bad mistakes. The kind of mistakes that turn close games into routs, and that turn favorites into losers. He threw interceptions. One came in the second quarter, when Jets safety Jim Hudson read a play perfectly, anticipated the route, and stepped in front of the pass with the kind of instinctive athleticism that separated great defenders from merely good ones. Another came on a trick play, a flea flicker, that was designed to catch the Jets' defense off guard and produce a long touchdown, but that instead resulted in a catastrophic interception by Randy Beverly, who picked off Morrall's pass in the end zone and killed what might have been Baltimore's best scoring opportunity of the first half. The Colts, who were supposed to be the overwhelming favorites, who were supposed to dominate this game from the opening whistle to the final gun, could not move the football with any consistency. Their offense, so potent and so productive during the regular season, was stifled, confused, disorganized, and increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ball, Joe Namath was doing exactly what he had told the world he was going to do. He was calm, he was composed, he was precise. He did not try to win the game with spectacular deep throws or daring high-risk plays that might produce turnovers. Instead, he picked the Colts' defense apart with the same methodical, surgical approach that he had devised during those long hours of film study. He hit George Sauer again and again on out patterns along the sideline, short, accurate throws that gained 6 or 8 or 12 yards at a time and kept the chains moving. He used the running game brilliantly, handing off to Matt Snell, the powerful fullback who pounded the ball into the teeth of the Colts' defense with a determination and a physicality that slowly, steadily wore them down. Snell was magnificent that afternoon, running with a power and a persistence that neutralized the Colts' defensive front and opened up the passing lanes that Namath needed to operate. Snell scored the game's first touchdown on a 4-yard run in the second quarter, crashing into the end zone behind a surge of blockers, and the Jets took a 7-0 lead into halftime. 7-0. The AFL's representative, the team that was supposed to lose by 3 touchdowns, the team that no one had given a chance, was leading the greatest team in NFL history at the halfway point of the Super Bowl. The halftime statistics told the story even more dramatically. The Jets had outgained the Colts. They had controlled the clock. They had won the turnover battle. They had been, by every meaningful measure, the better team for the first 30 minutes of football. The second half continued in much the same fashion. The Jets added field goals from Jim Turner, pushing their lead to 13-0 and then to 16-0. The Colts' coaches, growing increasingly desperate, made the decision to pull Morrill and insert Johnny Unitas, the legendary quarterback whose injury had opened the door for Morrill earlier in the season. Unitas, playing on a damaged arm that had not fully healed, tried to rally the Colts. He brought a professionalism and a composure to the position that had been lacking under the increasingly frazzled Morrill. He completed some passes. He moved the ball. He showed flashes of the brilliance that had made him the most celebrated quarterback in football history. But the Jets' defense, playing with the kind of inspired intensity that comes from knowing you are making history, would not relent. They bent occasionally, but they did not break, and the clock continued to run, each tick bringing the Jets closer to the victory that Joe Namath had guaranteed. The numbers from Namath's performance that day are striking, not for their spectacular quality, but for their controlled precision. He completed 17 of 28 passes for 206 yards. He threw no touchdowns and, critically, no interceptions. Those are not the numbers of a quarterback having a superhuman, once-in-a-lifetime performance. Those are the numbers of a quarterback in total and complete control of his team, his offense, and the game itself. A man who knew exactly what he needed to do, who had devised a plan to accomplish it, and who refused to deviate from that plan by doing anything more or anything less than what the moment required. He managed the game with the discipline of a chess master, sacrificing flash for function, spectacle for substance, individual glory for collective victory. The Colts finally managed to score a touchdown late in the fourth quarter, making the final score 16-7. But the outcome was never truly in doubt after the first quarter. The Jets had dominated the game in a way that stunned the sporting world, in a way that no one outside their own locker room had predicted or believed possible. The AFL team, the underdog, the team from the league that NFL partisans had dismissed as second-rate and inferior, had beaten the best team in the NFL, and it had not been a fluke. It had not been the result of a lucky bounce, a bad call, or a fortunate break. The Jets had been the better team on that Sunday in January, comprehensively and undeniably, and every person watching, in the stadium and on television sets across the country, knew it. When the final seconds ticked off the game clock, Namath jogged toward the tunnel that led to the Jets' locker room. As he ran, he raised his right hand and extended his index finger, pointing it toward the sky. That gesture, captured by photographers from every angle and broadcast to millions of viewers, became one of the most iconic images in the history of American sports. It was a moment of pure triumph, of absolute vindication, of a young man who had put his reputation, his credibility, and his pride on the line in front of the entire country, and had been proven right. The guarantee had been fulfilled. The impossible had happened. The world of professional football would never be the same. The aftermath of Super Bowl III was seismic in its impact. The victory legitimized the American Football League in a way that nothing else could have. If the AFL's champion could not merely compete with, but decisively defeat the NFL's best team, then the merger between the two leagues was not a marriage of unequals, not the absorption of a weaker entity by a stronger one. It was a genuine union, a partnership between two competitive organizations whose players and coaches were equally capable of excellence. the AFL teams could hold their heads high. Their players could claim, with the evidence of a Super Bowl victory behind them, that they were every bit as skilled, as tough, as dedicated, and as talented as their NFL counterparts. The psychological significance of this validation cannot be overstated. Without Super Bowl III, the AFL-NFL merger might have been remembered as a business transaction, a buyout, a takeover. With Super Bowl III, it became a joining of equals, and the unified league that emerged was stronger, more competitive, and more entertaining for it. Namath was named the game's most valuable player, an honour that was both richly deserved and somewhat incomplete, since the Jets' defence had been equally magnificent and perhaps even more instrumental in the victory. But the MVP award recognised something beyond the statistics. It recognised the guarantee, the courage, the leadership, and the sheer force of will that Namath had brought to the biggest game of his life. He was the face of the victory, the man whose words had defined the narrative, and the man whose performance had validated those words. In the days and weeks that followed, Namath became the most famous athlete in America. He was on magazine covers, on television programs, in advertisements for everything from shaving cream to automobiles. He was invited to the White House. He was recognized on the street in every city in the country. He was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a household name, known even to people who had no interest in football and no knowledge of the sport. Broadway Joe had transcended his sport and become a genuine cultural phenomenon. But the years that followed the Super Bowl brought Namath both continued glory and deepening pain. His knees, which had been damaged since his days at Alabama and which had deteriorated steadily throughout his professional career, continued their relentless decline. He underwent multiple surgeries in the years after the Super Bowl, each operation designed to repair or replace damaged cartilage, to tighten loosened ligaments, to restore some measure of the stability and mobility that his knees had once provided. Each surgery required weeks or months of rehabilitation, painful and tedious sessions of physical therapy designed to rebuild the muscle strength that atrophy had stolen. And each surgery, while providing temporary relief, left his knees a little weaker, a little less stable, a little closer to the point of no return. In the 1970 season, the Jets struggled badly. Namath missed significant time due to injuries, and when he was on the field, he was often operating at considerably less than full physical capacity. The team that had conquered the football world in January of '69 was aging rapidly. Key players retired, or the defense that had been so magnificent against the Colts was no longer the same dominating unit. Eubank, the steady, patient coach who had assembled the championship roster, was nearing the end of his tenure and seemed unable to replicate the magic of '68. The Jets were entering a period of decline, and Namath, for all his talent and all his determination, was powerless to stop it. The 1971 season brought more of the same frustration and pain. Namath played in just 4 games before a broken wrist ended his year abruptly. In 1972, he returned and played relatively well, but the Jets finished with a 7-7 record, not good enough for the playoffs, not good enough to recapture the glory of the championship season. The pattern would repeat itself with numbing regularity throughout the early 70s. Flashes of the old Namath brilliance, dazzling throws and impossible completions that reminded the world of what he could do when his body cooperated, interspersed with injuries, losses, and the slow, painful, inescapable realization that the window of championship contention had closed and would not be opening again. There were moments, though, scattered through those difficult years like diamonds in a coal mine. Brilliant, breathtaking moments that reminded everyone who watched them why Joe Namath was considered the most gifted passer of his generation. One of the most memorable came on September 24, 1972, when Namath led the Jets against the Baltimore Colts in a regular season game. It was a reunion of sorts, a rematch between the Super Bowl adversaries, though both teams had changed considerably in the years since that January day in Miami. Namath threw for 496 yards in that game, an astonishing, almost incomprehensible total that demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that he still possessed the most talented arm in all of professional football. 496 yards. on damaged knees, behind an offensive line that was a shadow of the unit that had protected him in the Super Bowl. It was a performance that existed outside the normal boundaries of what was considered possible, and that left even his most skeptical critics shaking their heads in reluctant admiration. Another came in December of that same 1972 season, when Namath threw 6 touchdown passes in a single game against those same Baltimore Colts. 6 touchdowns in one afternoon, on knees that ached with every step, behind a struggling offensive line for a team that was going nowhere in the standings and had nothing to play for but pride. It was a performance that existed almost outside of context, a pure and undiluted expression of athletic genius that transcended the mundane concerns of wins and losses and playoff implications. It was Broadway Joe at his absolute finest, throwing the football as if it weighed nothing at all, finding receivers in spaces that should not have existed, making the impossible look routine and the routine look effortless. But the Jets could not build a consistent winner around their aging and increasingly fragile quarterback. The 1973 season was another disappointment. The 1974 season was worse. Namath's knees required yet more surgery. The pain was constant and grinding, the kind of pain that follows you from the moment you wake up to the moment you finally fall asleep. The kind that becomes so familiar it begins to feel like a permanent part of who you are. The rehabilitation was grueling, and the results on the field were diminishing with each passing season. The Jets finished 4-10 in '74, and the whispers that had been circulating for years became loud enough to be heard in every press box and every bar in New York City. Was Namath finished? Had the game finally caught up with him? Could he still play at the level required to compete in professional football? The 1975 season provided only a partial answer. Namath played in 7 games before yet another knee injury ended his season prematurely. But in those 7 games, he showed enough flashes of his old brilliance, enough moments of that old magic, to keep the hope alive, to make people wonder what might have been if his knees had held up, if the Jets had built a better team around him, if the football gods had been even slightly kinder to a man who had given so much to their game. There is a cruelty to professional sports that is unique among human endeavors. The body does not care about legacy. It does not care about records or championships or guarantees or the expectations of millions of fans. The body breaks down according to its own schedule, indifferent to the desires of the mind, the ambitions of the heart, and the demands of the crowd. Joe Namath's body began breaking down almost from the moment he arrived in professional football, and by the mid-1970s, it had taken nearly everything it could from a man who had once seemed invincible, who had once seemed capable of anything. In 1976, Namath played in 11 games and threw 16 touchdowns. It was a decent season by most standards, but for a player of Namath's talent and reputation, a player who had once thrown for 4,000 yards in a single year, it felt like a diminished return, like watching a great painting slowly fade in the sunlight. The Jets were not contenders. The magic of Super Bowl III was nearly a decade in the past, a memory that grew more distant with each losing season. The team and its quarterback were relics of a different era, playing out the string in a league that had moved on and would not be coming back for them. In 1976, Namath played in 11 games and threw 16 touchdowns. It was a decent season by most standards, but for a player of Namath's talent and reputation, a player who had once thrown for 4,000 yards in a single year, it felt like a diminished return, like watching a great painting slowly fade in the sunlight. The Jets were not contenders. The magic of Super Bowl III was nearly a decade in the past, a memory that grew more distant with each losing season. The team and its quarterback were relics of a different era, playing out the string in a league that had moved on and would not be coming back for them. There is a particular kind of sadness that attaches itself to great athletes in decline, a sadness that is different from the ordinary disappointments of life because it involves the loss of something that was visible, measurable, and universally admired. When an ordinary person grows older and loses a step, the loss is private, noticed only by those closest to them. When a great athlete grows older and loses a step, the loss is public, witnessed by millions, commented upon by strangers, recorded in statistics and highlight reels that document the deterioration with pitiless precision. Namath experienced this public diminishment for years, each season a little slower, each throw a fraction less crisp, each game a reminder of the gap between what he had been and what he had become. He bore it with dignity, refusing to make excuses, refusing to blame the knees or the supporting cast or the coaches or the system. He simply went out and played, as best he could, for as long as he could, because that was all he knew how to do. The final chapter of Namath's playing career came in 1977, when the Jets released him. It was a painful moment, the severing of a bond that had defined both the man and the franchise for more than a decade. Namath signed with the Los Angeles Rams, hoping for one last shot at glory with a team that was considered a legitimate Super Bowl contender. The hope was that a change of scenery, a new coaching staff, a better supporting cast, and the warm California weather might rejuvenate the aging quarterback and give him one final opportunity to compete for a championship. The experiment was a failure, and in some ways it was the most painful chapter of Namath's playing career. He played in just 4 games for the Rams, completing 50% of his passes for 606 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. He looked old on the field. He looked slow. He looked tentative in ways he had never looked before, even at his most injured. He looked, for the first time in his career, like a man who no longer belonged on a professional football field, a man whose body had finally and irrevocably given out, whose knees could no longer support the demands of a game that had always been, at its fundamental core, a young man's pursuit. The California sun, which was supposed to revive him, only illuminated the extent of his decline. It was a painful and somewhat ignominious end to a career that had been defined by brilliance and bravery, and it was made more painful by the public nature of the decline, by the cameras that captured every laboured movement and every errant throw. He retired after the 1977 season at the age of 34, his body worn down far beyond what those years would normally suggest. His career statistics tell a complicated and somewhat contradictory story, a story that has fueled arguments among football fans and historians for more than 4 decades. He threw for 27,663 yards and 173 touchdowns over 13 professional seasons. He also threw 220 interceptions, a number that gives pause even to his most devoted admirers. His career completion percentage was just over 50%. His teams won 62 games, lost 63, and tied 1. By the cold and unforgiving mathematics of football statistics, by the metrics that modern analysts use to evaluate quarterbacks, Namath was a good but not great player, a man whose numbers did not match his legend, whose statistical profile was that of a slightly above-average starter rather than an all-time great. But the cold mathematics of football statistics have never told the whole story of any player, and they tell a particularly incomplete story of Joe Namath. They do not account for the knees that robbed him of mobility and forced him to play his entire career as a stationary target. They do not account for the years spent behind offensive lines that provided inadequate protection. They do not account for the supporting casts that were, with the exception of the championship year, rarely good enough to compete with the best teams in the league. They do not account for the 4,000-yard season that redefined what was possible for a professional quarterback. They do not account for Super Bowl III, the guarantee, the victory, the moment that changed the trajectory of professional football and validated an entire league. They do not account for the cultural impact, the way Namath redefined what it meant to be a professional athlete in America, the way he showed that an athlete could be simultaneously brilliant, rebellious, glamorous, and authentic. The Pro Football Hall of Fame inducted Namath in 1985 in a ceremony in Canton, Ohio, the small city where the NFL had been born 65 years earlier. It was a homecoming of sorts, a return to the heartland of professional football for a man whose career had played out on the biggest stages in America. The debate about whether he deserved the honor had been fierce in the years leading up to his induction, and has continued with undiminished intensity ever since, showing no signs of resolution or consensus. His detractors point to the statistics, to the losing record, to the interceptions, to the relatively brief period of true peak performance. His defenders point to the impact, to the 4,000-yard season, to the Super Bowl, to the guarantee, to the way he elevated the profile and the popularity of professional football at the most critical moment in the sport's history. Both sides have valid arguments. Both sides marshal evidence that supports their position. But the Hall of Fame voters, the men and women who are charged with deciding who belongs among the sport's immortals, made their decision, and they decided that Joe Namath's contributions to professional football transcended the numbers on the stat sheet. There was another dimension to Namath's career and his life that deserves careful attention, and that is his relationship with the league establishment and with the commissioner who served as its most visible representative. In the spring of 1969, just months after the Super Bowl triumph that had made him the most famous athlete in America, Commissioner Pete Rozelle ordered Namath to sell his ownership interest in Bachelor's the Three, the Manhattan bar and nightclub that had become one of the most famous establishments in New York City. Rozelle's concern was the bar's association with known gambling figures, men who frequented the establishment and who were, in the eyes of the league, a threat to the integrity of professional football. Namath, in a moment that was both deeply dramatic and profoundly revealing of his character, held a press conference and announced his immediate retirement from professional football rather than submit to Rozelle's demand. He was emotional during the announcement, visibly fighting back tears, and the moment shocked the entire football world. The man who had just guaranteed and won a Super Bowl, the most famous player in the sport, was walking away from the game rather than allow the league to dictate how he lived his private life. He eventually relented, selling his interest in the bar and returning to the Jets for the upcoming season. But the episode revealed something important and enduring about Namath's character, something that went deeper than the fur coats and the flashy lifestyle. He was a man who valued his independence, his personal autonomy, and his right to live his life according to his own values and his own judgment. The conflict with Rozelle was about more than a bar. It was about control, about authority, about who had the right to determine how a grown man spent his time and his money when he was not on the football field. It was, in its way, a harbinger of the battles over player rights, free agency, and individual liberty that would reshape the landscape of professional sports in the decades to come. The Bachelor's the Three controversy also cast a spotlight on the persistent shadow that gambling cast over professional football in that era. The league's relationship with gambling was a source of chronic anxiety for Rozelle and for the owners who employed him. The integrity of the game, the public's willingness to believe that the outcomes of football games were determined by talent and effort, rather than by the influence of organized crime, was the foundation upon which the entire multi-million-dollar enterprise rested. Namath was never accused of any wrongdoing related to gambling. No one ever suggested that he had fixed a game, shaved points, or been influenced by gamblers in any way. But the mere association of his bar with men who had connections to the gambling world was enough to trigger the commissioner's intervention. It was a vivid reminder that in the world of professional sports, perception could be as damaging as reality, and that a player's off-field associations could threaten the very foundation of the institution he served. Throughout the early to mid-1970s, as his playing career wound down through a succession of injuries and disappointing seasons, Namath's life off the field remained as colourful and as public as ever. He continued to appear in television commercials, most memorably in a beauty mist pantyhose advertisement that became one of the most talked about commercials of the decade. The commercial showed Namath, the toughest and most famous quarterback in America, the man who had stood in the pocket and absorbed hits from the largest and most violent men on the planet, wearing women's pantyhose and inviting the viewer to examine his legs. It was shocking, hilarious, and strangely brilliant. It challenged every conventional notion of masculinity that existed in American culture in the 1970s. And Namath sold it with the same unshakable confidence that he brought to everything else in his life. He was not embarrassed. He was not apologetic. He was Broadway Joe, and Broadway Joe could get away with anything. He appeared on talk shows and game shows. He acted in films and television movies with varying degrees of commercial and critical success. He was a fixture on the celebrity circuit in New York and Hollywood, a regular at the most glamorous parties and events. He dated some of the most famous and beautiful women of his era. He lived a life that was, by any conventional measure, extraordinary in its scope and its intensity. He appeared on talk shows and game shows. He acted in films and television movies, with varying degrees of commercial and critical success. He had a memorable role in a film called CC and Company alongside Anne Margaret, and he appeared on variety shows, where his charm and his natural ease in front of the camera made him a popular guest. He was a fixture on the celebrity circuit in New York and Hollywood, a regular at the most glamorous parties and events, a man who moved as easily through the worlds of entertainment and fashion as he did through the world of professional sports. He dated some of the most famous and beautiful women of his era, and the gossip columns tracked his romantic life with a fascination that would have been more appropriate for a movie star than for an athlete. He lived a life that was, by any conventional measure, extraordinary in its scope, its intensity, and its variety. A life that seemed to contain enough experience and adventure for 3 or 4 ordinary lifetimes. But beneath the surface of this glamorous and seemingly charmed existence, there was a cost that was accumulating with each passing year. The physical cost was the most obvious and the most well documented. His knees were a constant source of pain that never fully subsided, pain that required daily management, and that coloured every aspect of his daily life. Surgery after surgery had left the joints scarred, weakened, and increasingly unreliable. He walked with a noticeable limp that would become more pronounced as the years went on. The simple acts of climbing stairs, rising from a chair, walking across a room, activities that healthy people performed without thought, were for Namath sources of discomfort and frustration that reminded him constantly of what the game had taken from him. The emotional cost was less visible but no less real and no less significant. The pressure of being Broadway Joe, of being the man who had guaranteed and won the most famous football game in history, of being expected to be charming and confident and larger than life in every interaction with every stranger and every camera, was immense and unrelenting. Fame at the level that Namath experienced it is not simply a condition. It is a performance, a perpetual act of self-presentation that leaves very little room for the ordinary, messy, uncertain reality of being a human being. Namath shouldered this burden with apparent ease for years, projecting the image of a man who was always in control, always comfortable, always confident. But there were moments when the weight showed through, when the bravado slipped, and the vulnerability beneath was briefly, painfully visible to those who were paying close enough attention. Namath married Deborah Mays in 1984, and the couple had 2 daughters, Jessica and Olivia. The marriage brought a measure of stability and domesticity to a life that had been defined by constant motion and relentless public attention. For the first time, Namath had a family of his own, responsibilities that extended beyond the football field and the nightclub, a reason to come home and stay home. But the marriage ended in divorce in the year 2000, and Namath found himself facing the challenge of rebuilding his personal life in middle age, far from the stadiums and the spotlight that had defined his youth. The public caught a painful glimpse of Namath's private struggles in 2003 during a nationally televised Monday Night Football game. Namath, working the sideline as a guest commentator, gave an on-camera interview with ESPN reporter Susie Colbert that quickly became infamous. He was visibly and unmistakably intoxicated, his speech slurred, his behavior erratic. He made comments to Colbert on national television that were inappropriate and uncomfortable to witness. The moment was broadcast to millions of viewers and replayed endlessly in the days that followed. It was excruciating to watch, a public display of vulnerability from a man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of supreme confidence and invincibility. It was a reminder, painful and inescapable, that the larger-than-life persona of Broadway Joe concealed a human being who was wrestling with challenges that fame and money and even a Super Bowl ring could not solve. Namath addressed the incident publicly with the same directness and candor that had always defined him. He acknowledged openly that he had a problem with alcohol. He sought professional help. He entered a treatment program and committed himself fully to the difficult, demanding, and deeply personal work of achieving and maintaining sobriety. It was a decision that required a kind of personal courage that was fundamentally different from, but no less real and no less admirable than, the courage he had displayed on football fields for 13 grueling years. It was a private battle fought in the most public of arenas, under the scrutiny of a media and a public that had watched him play and had followed his life for decades. And Namath's willingness to be honest about his struggle, to admit his vulnerability publicly and without qualification, to ask for help rather than pretend that everything was fine, earned him a new and perhaps deeper kind of respect and a new kind of sympathy from millions of Americans who understood, from their own lives and their own experiences, that even legends are, in the end, human beings, with human frailties and human needs and human breaking points. When you strip away the fur coats and the guarantees and the television commercials, when you look past the headlines and the highlight reels and the carefully curated image of Broadway Joe, what you find at the center of Joe Namath's story is something profoundly and inescapably human. It is the story of a man who was given an extraordinary gift and who spent his life paying for it, not in installments, not on a schedule, but constantly, relentlessly, with every step and every morning and every attempt to rise from a chair or walk down a flight of stairs. The gift was his right arm. That arm could do things that other arms simply could not do, things that seemed to exist at the boundary between athletic achievement and something closer to art. It could launch a football 60 yards through the air with a throwing motion so smooth and so effortless that it looked less like an athletic act than a natural phenomenon, like water flowing downhill or wind moving through trees. It could deliver a pass into a window so narrow that physics seemed to suggest it should not be possible, threading the ball between two defenders with a precision that left coaches, teammates, and opponents alike shaking their heads in astonishment. It could change the direction of a football game, the fortunes of a franchise, the trajectory of an entire professional sport, and ultimately the cultural landscape of an entire nation. That arm was Joe Namath's blessing, the source of everything he achieved and everything he became. And it was his curse, because the arm demanded a body that could support it, and that body was failing almost from the start, because the magnificent arm was attached to a pair of knees that were already breaking down before Joe Namath ever played a single professional game. The knees. Always the knees. From the time he arrived at the University of Alabama as a freshman in 1961, from the time he first stepped onto a college football field and demonstrated the talent that would make him the most sought-after prospect in the country, Namath's knees were a ticking clock, counting down the minutes of a career that should have lasted decades, but that was instead compressed into a handful of brilliant, painful, and ultimately unforgettable years. The ligaments that held the joints together were damaged and repaired and damaged again, each cycle of injury and surgery leaving them weaker, less stable, less capable of doing the work that a professional football career demanded. Let that sink in. The most famous quarterback of his generation, the man who guaranteed and won a Super Bowl, the man who threw for more than 4,000 yards in a single season before any other quarterback in the history of professional football, had accomplished that feat, played his entire career on knees that were held together with surgical stitches, scar tissue, and an almost unfathomable reserve of willpower. Every drop back into the pocket, every plant of the foot before a throw, every hit he absorbed from a charging defensive end or a blitzing linebacker, every time he struggled to his feet after being driven into the turf by 250 pounds of hostile intent, all of it was accomplished on a structural foundation that was fundamentally, irreparably compromised. He was building a skyscraper of achievement on a foundation of sand, and the fact that the skyscraper stood as long as it did is one of the most remarkable facts in the history of professional sports. The medical technology available in the 1960s and 1970s was primitive by modern standards, almost unrecognizably so. Today, a torn anterior cruciate ligament can be repaired through arthroscopic surgery, a minimally invasive procedure that involves small incisions, specialized cameras, and precision instruments that allow surgeons to work with extraordinary accuracy. The rehabilitation period is measured in months, and the success rate is remarkably high. Athletes return from ACL tears to perform at the highest levels of their sports, with a regularity that would have seemed miraculous to the doctors who treated Joe Namath. In Namath's era, knee surgery was an entirely different experience. It meant large incisions that cut through skin, muscle, and tissue to expose the damaged joint. It meant lengthy hospital stays, often lasting a week or more. It meant rehabilitation protocols that were often little more than educated guesswork, based on intuition and tradition rather than the evidence-based medicine that guides treatment today. Each surgery left behind more scar tissue, more inflammation, less stability, less range of motion, less of the natural cushioning that healthy knees provide. Each surgery brought Namath one step closer to the day when his body would simply refuse to cooperate any longer, when the knees would declare, in their silent and implacable way, that they had given everything they had to give. Namath had his first major knee surgery after his senior season at Alabama, before he had thrown a single pass in a professional football game. Think about that for a moment. Before he ever stepped onto an AFL field, before he ever wore a Jets jersey, before Sonny Werblin's enormous contract and the penthouse apartment and the fur coats and the guarantee, his knees were already damaged goods. He would undergo multiple additional surgeries throughout his career with the Jets, each one a desperate attempt to hold together a body that was determined to come apart. By the time he finally retired after the 1977 season, his knees had been operated on so many times that the joints bore almost no resemblance to what nature had originally designed. They were reconstructed approximations, held together by scar tissue and surgical hardware, functioning well enough to allow him to walk, but never again well enough to allow him to run or to move with the freedom and the confidence that a young, healthy body takes for granted. He lived with chronic pain for the rest of his life, a constant, grinding, inescapable reminder of the price he had paid for the moments of glory that had made him famous and that had changed the course of a sport. And here is the deeper truth of Joe Namath's story, the truth that sits at the center of everything else, the truth that gives the legend its weight and its poignancy, the same qualities that made him great, the fearlessness, the confidence, the competitive fire, the absolute, unwavering refusal to acknowledge his own physical limitations, were the very qualities that contributed to his physical destruction. A more cautious quarterback, a quarterback with a stronger instinct for self-preservation, might have protected himself more effectively. He might have slid to avoid hits. He might have thrown the ball away when the pressure closed in, rather than standing tall in the pocket and absorbing the full force of a defensive lineman's charge. He might have limited his exposure, managed his workload, taken games off to rest and recover, but Namath did none of those things. He stood in the pocket. He took the hits. He delivered the football with defenders bearing down on him from every direction. And he accepted the punishment that came with it, game after game, season after season, until there was nothing left to give. He played through pain that would have forced most men to the sideline. He played through injuries that modern team doctors would never have allowed a player to compete with. He played because he could not conceive of not playing, because the idea of sitting on the bench while his teammates took the field was simply incompatible with who he was at the deepest level of his being. Let that sink in. The very thing that made him a legend, the fearlessness, the refusal to yield, the willingness to sacrifice his body for a game and a team and a moment, is the thing that broke him. The courage that made him great is the courage that left him hobbling through his 40s, his 50s, his 60s, and beyond. The same fire that lit up football fields across America is the fire that burned through his cartilage and his ligaments and his capacity for pain-free movement. There is something about that truth that resonates far beyond the boundaries of football, beyond the world of professional sports entirely. It speaks to the fundamental bargain that life extends to those who pursue greatness in any field, in any endeavor, in any domain of human achievement. You can be extraordinary, but it will cost you. You can accomplish things that no one else has accomplished, but the accomplishment will leave its marks on you Visible and invisible, physical and emotional, permanent and irreversible. You can stand at the pinnacle of your profession and hear the roar of the crowd and feel the intoxicating rush of victory, but eventually the crowd will go home and the rush will fade and you will be left alone with the consequences of what you gave, with the invoice that greatness presented and that you paid in full. Namath's football life has been a testament to his resilience, his adaptability, and his fundamental humanity. After retiring from the game, he remained in the public eye, working as a television commentator for football broadcasts, appearing in films and television shows, lending his name and his presence to various business ventures and charitable causes. But he was no longer Broadway Joe in the way that title had been understood during his playing days. He was a man in his 40s, then his 50s, then his 60s, dealing with the physical and emotional consequences of a career that had consumed his youth, his health, and a significant portion of his capacity for the kind of carefree enjoyment that most people take for granted. His decision to seek treatment for alcohol dependency in the early 2000s was a turning point in his life, a moment of reckoning that redefined him in the eyes of the public and, more importantly, in his own eyes. The brash young quarterback who had guaranteed a Super Bowl victory, who had lived the most glamorous and public life imaginable, had become a middle-aged man standing in front of the world and acknowledging with the same directness that had always defined him that he was struggling, that he needed help, that the persona of Broadway Joe, however magnificent and however useful it had been, was not sufficient armor against the ordinary, devastating, deeply human challenge of addiction. The public response was overwhelmingly compassionate and supportive. People understood, instinctively and empathetically, that fame is not a shield against suffering, that talent does not immunize a person against the struggles that confront every human being, that even the most confident and successful among us can find themselves in need of help from others. In the years since his recovery, Namath has spoken with remarkable openness about his journey, about the challenges of life after football, about the physical toll the game extracted from his body, and about his commitment to maintaining sobriety one day at a time. He has become an advocate for former professional football players who are dealing with the long-term health consequences of their careers, particularly those suffering from the effects of repeated head trauma and the degenerative brain condition known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Namath himself has undergone hyperbaric oxygen therapy, a treatment that involves breathing pure oxygen in a pressurized chamber, which he has publicly credited with improving his cognitive function and his overall sense of well-being. His willingness to discuss these treatments openly, to put his name and his reputation behind the cause of player health, has given the issue a visibility and an urgency that it might not otherwise have received. His advocacy connects the deeply personal to the broadly systemic in a way that is both powerful and necessary. When Joe Namath speaks about the need for better medical care for retired players, for more funding for research into the long-term effects of football on the human brain and body, for a system that does not simply consume athletes during their playing years and then discard them when their usefulness has ended, he speaks from a place of authority that few others can claim. He knows what the game takes, because it took from him. He knows the price of glory, because he has been paying it for more than 5 decades. And his voice, the same voice that once guaranteed a Super Bowl victory in a banquet hall in Miami, now carries a different kind of weight, a weight born not of bravado but of experience, not of confidence but of hard-won wisdom. The question of Namath's legacy has always been complicated by the tension between his enormous cultural impact and his imperfect statistical record. The numbers viewed in isolation are not the numbers of an all-time great quarterback. His career passer rating was 65.5, a figure that places him well below the elite quarterbacks of his own era and far below the quarterbacks who dominate the modern game. He threw more interceptions than touchdowns over the course of his career, a ratio that modern analysts would consider disqualifying. He had a losing record as a starting quarterback. If you judged Joe Namath purely by the data, purely by the metrics and the analytics, that have come to dominate the evaluation of professional athletes, you would conclude that he was a competent but unspectacular player who happened to have one transcendent moment in an otherwise middling career. But judging Joe Namath purely by the numbers is like judging a symphony purely by counting the notes, like judging a novel purely by counting the pages, like judging a life purely by counting the years. It misses the point entirely, completely, and perhaps willfully. Namath's impact on professional football was not primarily a matter of statistics. It was cultural, commercial, structural, and profoundly transformative. He helped legitimize the American Football League at the most critical juncture in its history. He helped turn the Super Bowl from a football game into the most watched television event in America. He helped transform the quarterback position from a functional role that demanded conformity and anonymity into a starring role that celebrated individuality, personality, and charisma. He helped make professional football appealing to audiences who had never cared about the sport before. Audiences who were drawn not to the X's and O's, but to the personality, the drama, and the spectacle that Namath brought to every game he played and every room he entered. There is also the haunting, unanswerable question of what might have been, the question that shadows every great athlete whose career was cut short or diminished by forces beyond their control. What might Joe Namath have accomplished if his knees had held up? What if he had played his entire career on two healthy, fully functional legs, with the ability to move in the pocket, to extend plays, to scramble away from pressure, to avoid the devastating hits that slowly and systematically ground him down? What if the Jets had surrounded him with the caliber of talent that his ability deserved, not just in 1968, but throughout his career? What if the quarterback, with the greatest arm of his generation, had been given the career that his talent warranted? These questions exist in the realm of imagination and speculation. In a parallel universe where things turned out differently, where the body cooperated and the roster was deeper, and the breaks fell the right way. They have no definitive answers and never will. But they are worth contemplating because they illuminate the vast distance between what Namath achieved and what he might have achieved. And that distance is itself a part of his legend. The greatest legends in sports are rarely stories of unbroken triumph and unblemished success. They are stories of potential and sacrifice, of extraordinary gifts and the prices exacted for possessing them, of what was given to the world and what was lost in the giving. Consider the trajectory of Namath's career from a purely physical perspective. He entered professional football at the age of 21 with knees that had already been surgically repaired. By 23, he had thrown for 4,000 yards, a feat so extraordinary that it would not be matched for more than a decade. By 25, he had guaranteed and won a Super Bowl, achieving the single greatest upset in the history of professional football, and validating an entire league in the process. By 28, he was already dealing with the chronic effects of multiple knee surgeries, his mobility significantly reduced, his body no longer capable of the athletic feats that had defined his early career. By 30, he was managing constant pain and missing significant portions of each season to injuries. By 34, he was finished, released by the Jets, and cast adrift by the Rams, a once great player whose body had simply worn out, eroded by years of punishment and surgical intervention until there was nothing left to build upon. That arc, from transcendent talent to physical decline, is compressed into barely more than a decade of professional play. 13 seasons, that is all Joe Namath had. 13 seasons, many of them interrupted by injuries. Many of them played at diminished capacity, many of them spent on teams that were not good enough to compete for championships. In those 13 seasons, he transformed the sport of professional football, redefined the quarterback position, turned the Super Bowl into a national institution, and became one of the most famous and culturally significant athletes in American history. He did all of that in 13 seasons, on broken knees, with a supporting cast that was often inadequate, against defenses that were allowed to punish quarterbacks in ways that would draw flags and fines and suspensions in the modern game. The concentrated intensity of that achievement, the sheer density of impact packed into such a limited window, is one of the most remarkable aspects of Namath's story, and one of the reasons his legend endures even as other quarterbacks have surpassed his statistical records many times over. There is a paradox embedded in the way we remember and evaluate athletes that Namath's story illustrates with particular clarity. We tend to celebrate the athletes who played the longest, who accumulated the most impressive statistics, who maintain their performance over the widest span of years. Longevity is valued, perhaps overvalued, in our assessment of athletic greatness, but the most compelling stories in sports, the stories that survive in our collective memory long after the statistics have faded into footnotes, are often stories of brilliance cut short, of potential unrealized, of what might have been. We remember the flame that burned brightest, even if it burned briefest. We remember the player who changed everything in a moment, even if that moment was followed by years of diminishment and decline. We remember the guarantee, and we remember the price. The tension between Namath's cultural significance and his statistical record will never be fully resolved, and perhaps it should not be. It is the tension itself that keeps the conversation alive, that keeps people arguing about Joe Namath's place in the pantheon of professional football decades after he threw his last pass. It is the tension that makes him interesting, that makes him more than a collection of numbers in a record book, that makes him a figure of genuine fascination and genuine consequence. If Namath had been merely a great statistical quarterback, his story would have been impressive but ordinary, another entry in a long list of talented players who performed at a high level for an extended period. It is the gap between what the numbers say and what the eyes saw, between the cold data and the lived experience, between the record and the reality, that elevates Namath's story from the impressive to the unforgettable. And at the heart of it all, beneath the statistics and the cultural impact and the philosophical questions about the nature of greatness, there is simply a man. A man who grew up in a mill town and learned to throw a football with an arm that seemed designed for nothing else. A man who left home at 18 and travelled to a place as foreign as another country to play for the most demanding coach in America. A man who arrived in New York City with damaged knees and a contract that seemed like all the money in the world, and proceeded to conquer the most unforgiving city on earth with nothing but his talent and his personality. A man who stood at a podium and said 3 words that changed everything. A man who delivered on that promise and then spent the rest of his life dealing with the consequences. A man who struggled and fell and got back up again and again because getting back up was the only thing he knew how to do. That man is Joe Namath, and his story is not finished yet, but its deepest truths have already been written in the scars on his knees and the records in the books, and the memory of a finger pointing toward a Miami sky on a warm January afternoon more than half a century ago. More than 50 years have passed since Joe Namath raised that index finger toward the Miami sky, and the image has not faded. It has not been replaced by newer, shinier moments. It has not been diminished by the passage of time or by the flood of Super Bowl highlights that have accumulated in the decades since. It has become one of those permanent fixtures of American sports culture, a moment so perfectly captured, so precisely emblematic of everything it represented, that it has transcended its original context and become something larger. It has become a symbol of confidence and self-belief, of defiance against the odds, of the extraordinary and sometimes miraculous power of belief to shape reality. It has become a touchstone, a reference point, a story that parents tell their children and that coaches invoke when they want to remind their players that the impossible is sometimes possible after all. The Super Bowl itself has grown into a spectacle of such magnitude that it would be unrecognizable to the men who played in that 3rd edition of the game on a warm January afternoon in Miami. What was once a football game played in a stadium that was not even full, before an audience that was large but not overwhelming, has become the most watched television event in America and arguably in the world. It draws more than 100 million viewers annually. It commands advertising rates that run into the millions of dollars for a single 30-second spot. It has become an unofficial national holiday, a day when Americans gather in living rooms and sports bars and backyards to watch not just a football game but a cultural event, a halftime show, a parade of commercials, a shared experience that unites a fragmented and distracted nation for a few hours every February. None of this would exist in its current form, with its current scale, with its current cultural significance, without what happened on that warm January afternoon when a brash young quarterback from Pennsylvania proved that the accepted wisdom was wrong and that the impossible was, in fact, within reach. Namath's legacy extends far beyond the Super Bowl itself, of course. He was a pioneer in the relationship between professional athletes and the broader worlds of media, commerce, and popular culture. He showed that an athlete could be more than an athlete, that a person who excelled in a sport could also be a brand, a personality, a cultural force whose influence and appeal extended far beyond the playing field and the stadium gates. In doing so, in blazing that trail with his fur coats and his television appearances and his willingness to be a public figure in the fullest sense of the term, he paved the way for every athlete who followed him into the world of endorsements, media appearances, and personal branding. From Magic Johnson to Michael Jordan to LeBron James to Patrick Mahomes, every athlete who has leveraged athletic fame into commercial success, cultural influence, and personal wealth owes a debt, whether they know it or not, to Joe Namath. He was the first, or very nearly the first, and the path he cut through the wilderness of sports commerce is the path that everyone who followed has walked. He also changed the quarterback position itself in ways that are so fundamental and so pervasive that they are easy to overlook precisely because they have become the accepted norm. Before Namath, professional football quarterbacks were expected to be stoic, self-effacing, and largely anonymous. They were functionaries. The men who called the signals and handed off the ball and occasionally threw a pass, but who were emphatically not expected to be celebrities or to carry the personality of an entire franchise on their shoulders. The quarterback was part of a team, and the team was greater than any individual, and any quarterback who forgot that lesson was quickly reminded of it by coaches who valued conformity above all else. After Namath, quarterbacks became the face of their teams, the stars around whom entire organizations were constructed, the personalities that fans identified with, and that television networks promoted, and that corporate sponsors sought out. The modern NFL quarterback, with his celebrity status, his multi-million-dollar endorsement portfolio, his influence on team strategy and personnel decisions, his role as the public face and the emotional center of a billion-dollar franchise, is a direct and unmistakable descendant of the model that Joe Namath created, almost accidentally, by the simple act of being himself. There is a philosophical dimension to Namath's legacy that is worth pausing to consider, a dimension that goes beyond sports and touches on something universal about the human experience. His guarantee before Super Bowl III was an act of radical self-belief, a declaration of confidence so complete and so public that it left no room for retreat or qualification. In a world that increasingly operates on data, probability, risk assessment, and the careful management of expectations, there is something almost quaint, almost anachronistic, about a man who simply declared that he was going to accomplish something extraordinary and then went out and did it. We live now in an age of hedging and caveats, of careful language and managed expectations. Athletes are coached by media consultants to say the right things, to avoid bold predictions, to speak in generalities that offend no one and inspire no one. Namath operated in a different universe. He put himself on the line, fully, publicly, and without reservation. And he delivered. What does that tell us about the nature of confidence and its relationship to achievement? What does it reveal about the connection between believing something is possible and making it so? These are questions that philosophers, psychologists, and coaches have contemplated for centuries, and Joe Namath's guarantee presents them in their most vivid and compelling form. Did he win because he believed he would win? Or did he believe he would win because his preparation, his study, his understanding of the game had shown him, at a level deeper than conscious thought, that the Colts could be beaten? The answer is almost certainly both, intertwined so closely that separating them is impossible. The preparation provided the foundation for the belief, and the belief liberated him to perform at his absolute best when the moment of truth arrived. It is not a line of causation, it is a circle, and that circle lies at the heart of every great performance, in every field, in every era. Namath's era was profoundly different from our own, and the differences illuminate truths about both his time and ours that are worth examining with care and without nostalgia. The money in professional sports was incomparably smaller. A contract that was considered revolutionary in 1965, the $427,000 that Werblin paid to bring Namath to the Jets, would barely qualify as a practice squad salary in the modern NFL, where star quarterbacks sign contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The media presence was less pervasive and less instantaneous. There was no social media, no 24-hour sports television, no smartphone cameras capturing every public moment and broadcasting it to the world in real time. The pace at which information traveled was slower, the news cycle measured in days rather than seconds or minutes. A professional athlete could still walk down the street in most American cities without being mobbed, photographed, or harassed by strangers with cameras. The game itself was rawer, more physical, more violent, less regulated by the elaborate and ever-expanding framework of rules that have been designed in the decades since Namath played to protect players from the most dangerous and debilitating consequences of their profession. It was, in many important ways, a simpler and more innocent time for professional sports, though the simplicity concealed complexities and injustices that are only now becoming fully visible, fully acknowledged, and fully addressed. The conversation about player health, about the long-term physical and neurological consequences of the repeated trauma that professional football inflicts on the bodies and brains of the men who play it, about the moral and ethical obligations of a league that generates billions of dollars in revenue each year from the labor, the talent, and the physical sacrifice of those players. This conversation, which has become one of the most important and most contentious in all of American sports, owes something to men like Joe Namath. When we see him today, walking with the stiff, careful gait of a man whose knees were sacrificed on the altar of football glory, we are seeing the human cost of the spectacle that entertains us. We are seeing the price tag attached to every thrilling play, every dramatic victory, every Super Bowl Sunday that brings the nation together. It is a price that has been paid by thousands of players over the decades, and it is a price that deserves to be acknowledged, understood, confronted, and ultimately addressed. The generation of quarterbacks who followed Namath has acknowledged his influence in terms that border on the reverential. Terry Bradshaw, who led the Pittsburgh Steelers to 4 Super Bowl championships during the 1970s, has credited Namath with demonstrating that a quarterback could be simultaneously tough and charismatic, that physical courage and personal flair were not mutually exclusive qualities. Dan Marino, who grew up in Pittsburgh idolizing Namath, and who went on to set passing records that endured for decades, modeled his own legendarily quick release on the throwing motion that Namath had made famous. Even Tom Brady, who has won more Super Bowls than any quarterback in the history of the sport, and who has his own legitimate claim to the title of greatest quarterback of all time, has spoken publicly and respectfully about Namath's guarantee as one of the defining and most courageous moments in the history of professional football. These acknowledgements matter because they place Namath firmly in the lineage of greatness, in the unbroken chain of influence and inspiration that connects one generation of athletes to the next. Professional football, like all human endeavors, is built upon the achievements, the innovations, and the sacrifices of those who came before. Namath built upon the legacy of Johnny Unitas, Otto Graham, Sammy Baugh, and Sid Luckman, and those who came after Namath, the Bradshaws and the Marinos and the Montanas and the Mannings and the Bradys, built upon his legacy in turn. That chain of influence, stretching backward and forward through the decades, is perhaps Namath's most enduring and most significant legacy, more lasting than any single statistic, more meaningful than any individual game or season. What we lost when Joe Namath's career ended was not simply a great football player, though he was certainly that. We lost a particular kind of athlete, a man who understood instinctively that the game of football existed not in a vacuum, but within a culture, and that the culture could be shaped, enriched, and transformed by those who played the game with sufficient flair, sufficient courage, and sufficient force of personality. We lost a connection to a time when professional football was still finding its identity, still discovering its vast and untapped potential, still evolving and growing into the cultural behemoth that it would eventually and inevitably become. And we lost a living reminder that greatness in sport, and perhaps in life itself, is not measured solely in the currency of wins and losses and statistics, that it can also be measured in the way a person carries himself under the crushing weight of pressure, in the way he faces adversity with grace and without complaint, in the way he refuses, stubbornly and magnificently, and sometimes at great personal cost, to be defined by the expectations and the limitations that others attempt to impose upon him. Joe Namath refused. And in refusing, he became something far more significant than a football player with impressive numbers. He became a legend. In the end, what remains of Joe Namath is what remains of all great athletes who gave everything they had to the games they played and the moments they inhabited. Not the statistics, though the statistics endure in record books and databases, and the arguments of fans who will never stop debating their significance. Not the championship, though the championship endures in the memories of everyone who watched it, in the photographs and the film reels and the stories passed down from one generation to the next. Not the commercials or the magazine covers, or the late nights in Manhattan, or the penthouse apartment with the white lambskin rug, though all of those things are part of the rich and complicated tapestry of his life. What remains is something more fundamental than any of that, something that cannot be quantified or catalogued or stored in a database or reduced to a number on a page. What remains is the image of a young man standing at a podium in a banquet hall in Miami, Florida, looking the world directly in the eye with no trace of doubt or hesitation, and saying the words that no one in that room or anywhere else in America expected to hear. I guarantee it. 3 words. Simple, direct, and absolutely audacious in their certainty. Those 3 words changed a football game. They changed a football league. They changed a sport. They turned a young quarterback with bad knees and a golden arm into an enduring American legend. They turned a football game that might have been forgotten into a moment that will be remembered for as long as the sport is played. They turned a prediction into a promise, and a promise into a fact. What remains is the image of that same young man, 3 days after speaking those words, jogging off a football field in the warm Miami afternoon, with his right index finger raised above his head, pointing toward the sky. The smile on his face in that moment was not the smile of a man who had gotten lucky, who had rolled the dice, and happened to come up with the right number. It was the smile of a man who had known all along what was going to happen. It was the smile of certainty confirmed, of preparation validated, of a truth that had been spoken before it had been proven, and that was now, irrevocably and permanently, a matter of record. He had said the Jets would win, and the Jets had won. He had guaranteed it, and he had delivered. What remains is the knowledge, quiet and persistent and impossible to escape, that Joe Namath paid for that moment, and for all the moments that preceded and followed it with his body. He gave his knees to the game of football. He gave his mobility. He gave years and decades of comfort and ease that most people take for granted. He gave these things willingly, without complaint, without self-pity, because the game demanded them, and because he could not have lived with himself if he had held anything back. Every step he has taken since that January afternoon in 1969 has been a step taken with a memory of pain, a physical reminder of the bargain he struck with the sport he loved. He gave everything, and the game took everything it could. What remains is the understanding, earned through years of watching and reflecting, that fame is not a gift freely given, but a transaction with terms that are rarely disclosed in advance. Joe Namath received the adoration of millions of Americans. He received the attention of an entire country. He received the status of a cultural icon, a figure whose name and face were recognized in every corner of the nation. In return, he gave up things that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to dismiss. He gave up his privacy. He gave up his anonymity. He gave up the possibility of ever being an ordinary person, living an ordinary life, walking down an ordinary street without being recognized and approached and expected to perform the role of Broadway Joe. That persona, Broadway Joe, was both his greatest creation and his heaviest burden, his most valuable asset and his most persistent constraint. He wore the name with grace, with style, with an ease that made it look effortless. But no one wears a persona that large, that public, that all-encompassing, without feeling its weight pressing down on them in the quiet moments when the cameras are off and the crowds have gone home. What remains, above and beneath and through everything else, is the deeply human story that lies beneath the legend. A boy from a steel town in western Pennsylvania who could throw a football with an arm that seemed to have been designed by Providence for that single purpose and no other. A teenager who left home and traveled south to play for the most demanding and legendary coach in all of college football, a coach who loved him and was driven to distraction by him in roughly equal measure. A young man who arrived in New York City with damaged knees and an impossible contract and a personality so vivid that the largest city in the world seemed barely big enough to contain it. A quarterback who stood in pockets that were collapsing around him and delivered footballs to receivers that he should not have been able to reach, on legs that should not have been able to support him, in games that he should not have been able to win. A man who struggled in the years after football with the challenges that confront many retired athletes: the loss of identity, the loss of purpose, the loss of the daily structure, and the intense camaraderie that the game provides and that nothing else in life quite replaces. Joe Namath was not perfect. He never claimed to be perfect. He never asked to be placed on a pedestal or to be treated as anything other than what he was: a flawed, complicated, contradictory, and sometimes self-destructive human being who happened to possess one of the most remarkable right arms in the history of organized sport. He would be the first person to admit his imperfections, to acknowledge his mistakes, to take responsibility for the moments when he fell short of the standards he set for himself and that others set for him. But he was also, in every way that matters, brave. He was brave on the football field, where he stood in the pocket and absorbed hits from men who outweighed him by 50 or 60 or 70 pounds, who were running at full speed with the explicit intention of driving him into the ground. He was brave at that podium in Miami, where he staked his reputation, his credibility, and his pride on a prediction that every expert in America considered foolish and that most considered delusional. And he was brave in his later years, when he acknowledged his struggles with alcohol, when he sought help, when he chose the difficult path of honesty and vulnerability over the easier path of denial and image management, when he allowed the world to see that even Broadway Joe was, beneath the fur coats and the confidence and the legend, just a man trying, like all of us, to find his way. The game of professional football has changed in ways that Joe Namath could not have imagined when he first pulled on a green and white New York Jets jersey in the spring of 1965. The stadiums are larger and more technologically sophisticated. The contracts are measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. The television audiences number in the hundreds of millions worldwide. The rules have been rewritten to protect quarterbacks from the kind of punishment that Namath absorbed as a matter of routine. The equipment is lighter, stronger, and more protective. The training methods are more scientific. The speed of the game has increased exponentially. Everything about professional football has changed in the 6 decades since Namath entered the league. And yet the fundamental things, the things that matter most, remain precisely the same. A quarterback still drops back into the pocket and reads the defense. A receiver still runs his route and looks for the ball at the moment of truth. A defender still launches himself at the quarterback with everything he has, trying to reach him before the pass is released. The game is still, at its irreducible core, a contest of skill and will and courage, and it will always need men who possess those qualities in extraordinary abundance. Joe Namath possessed them. He possessed them in a measure that few athletes in the history of professional football have matched and that none have surpassed. And when the lights go out for the last time, and the stadium falls silent, and the final highlight has been replayed and analysed and debated for the last time, that is what will endure. Not the fur coats, not the pantyhose commercial, Not the penthouse on the Upper East Side, not the headlines or the gossip columns or the tabloid photographs. What will endure is the arm, the guarantee, the victory. And the price that was paid for all of it, paid willingly and without regret, paid in full, by a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some things in life are worth everything you have to give. There will never be another Joe Namath. There will be quarterbacks with better statistics and more impressive career numbers. There will be quarterbacks with more championship rings. There will be quarterbacks with longer careers and healthier bodies and more polished public images and few interceptions on their permanent record. But there will never be another man who stood at the exact intersection of sport and culture at exactly the right moment in American history and changed both of them forever with nothing more than his talent, his confidence, his willingness to risk everything on a single declaration, and 3 unforgettable words. He guaranteed it, and he delivered.